Chapter 1. The Midnight Confession. Susan Bones had given up on sleep hours ago. She sat curled in the corner of the Hufflepuff common room, her knees drawn up to her chest, staring at the dying embers in the fireplace. The letter from Aunt Amelia lay crumpled beside her on the yellow cushions, its urgent scrawl burned into her memory despite the late hour. The common room felt cavernous around her, all honey-coloured stone and burnished copper. But tonight, the familiar warmth couldn't touch the cold knot of dread that had taken residence in her stomach. Most of her housemates had gone to bed hours ago. The few who remained were scattered across the room in their own bubbles of late-night studying or quiet conversation, but Susan felt utterly alone. She kept reading and rereading the letter, as if the words might change if she looked at them long enough, as if the terrible implications might somehow rearrange themselves into something less devastating. Susan, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you must remain between us for now. I've discovered something that changes everything we thought we knew about Harry Potter's placement with his relatives. The evidence I've uncovered suggests deliberate negligence at the highest levels of our government. Negligence that resulted in years of documented abuse. I have reason to believe my investigation is being monitored. If something happens to me before I can present this case formally, you'll find copies of everything in the vault. Trust no one at the ministry except Kingsley. Tell Harry Potter he deserves to know the truth about who put him in that house and why they left him there. With love and urgency, Aunt Amelia. The letter was dated 3 days ago. Susan hadn't heard from her aunt since. She pressed her palms against her eyes, trying to push back the tears that threatened to spill over. Aunt Amelia wasn't the type to write dramatic letters or make wild accusations. She was methodical, careful, fair to a fault. If she said she had evidence of abuse, then she had evidence. If she said it went to the highest levels, then it went to the highest levels. But Harry Potter, the Harry Potter who had faced down Death Eaters and you-know-who himself? The idea that anyone would deliberately leave him in an abusive situation seemed impossible. And yet, Susan had seen the way Harry flinched sometimes when people reached for him too quickly. She'd noticed how thin he'd been when he arrived at school each year, how he never talked about his home life, how he seemed genuinely surprised when people were kind to him without wanting something in return. She'd attributed it to his fame, to the pressure of being the boy who lived. But what if there was something darker underneath? The thought made her sick. A soft sound from the portrait hole made her look up, and she watched as Hannah Abbott slipped inside, looking exhausted. Hannah caught sight of her and paused, concern flickering across her face. "Susan? What are you doing awake?" "Couldn't sleep," Susan managed, quickly shoving the letter into her robes. "You're up late, too." Hannah yawned and rubbed her eyes. "Astronomy homework. Professor Sinistra gave us that massive star chart project, remember?" She studied Susan's face more carefully. "Are you all right?" "You look—" "I'm fine." The lie felt bitter on her tongue. "Just thinking too much." Hannah looked like she wanted to press, but Susan turned away, curling deeper into the corner of the sofa. After a moment, she heard Hannah's footsteps retreating toward the dormitory stairs. The common room fell quiet again, leaving Susan alone with her churning thoughts. She couldn't stop thinking about Harry Potter sitting in the great hall, surrounded by friends, but somehow still isolated. She'd watched him during meals sometimes, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Everyone expected so much from him, to be their savior, their symbol, their proof that good could triumph over evil. But what if, all this time, the very people who put him on that pedestal had been the ones ensuring he suffered? The question gnawed at her until she couldn't sit still any longer. She needed answers, and there was only one person who could give them to her. Susan stood up, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. She needed to find Harry Potter. The castle corridors were dark and empty, lit only by the occasional torch flickering in its bracket. Susan moved carefully through the shadows, grateful for the soft soles of her shoes that made no sound against the stone floors. She'd become something of an expert at moving through Hogwarts unseen over the past few months, a skill she'd never thought she'd need until this year, when everything had gone so terribly wrong. The Ministry's campaign against Harry and Professor Dumbledore had created fractures throughout the school that went far deeper than house divisions. Students chose sides based on whether they believed Harry's claims about you-know-who's return, and the tension was palpable in every corridor, every classroom, every meal in the Great Hall. Susan had never doubted Harry's word, not after what she'd seen at the Department of Mysteries, but she'd also never imagined that the corruption might run so deep that it extended to Harry's very placement in the Muggle world. She found herself heading toward the 7th floor, following an instinct she couldn't quite name. There was a rumor among the DA members that Harry had been spending time in a special room that appeared when you needed it most, though she'd never seen it herself. If Harry was anywhere in the castle at this hour, it would be there. Somewhere he could be alone with his thoughts. The corridor on the 7th floor was empty and still, but Susan walked slowly along the stretch of blank wall opposite the tapestry of Barnabas the Barmy, thinking as hard as she could about needing a place to find Harry Potter. After her third pass, a door appeared in the wall, ornate and inviting. Susan's heart hammered against her ribs as she reached for the handle. She stepped inside and found herself in a room that looked like a cross between a library and a sitting room. Comfortable chairs were arranged around a warm fireplace, with bookshelves lining the walls and a few tables scattered throughout. And there, in one of the chairs facing the fire, was Harry Potter. He looked up as she entered, and Susan saw her own surprise reflected in his green eyes. His dark hair was even more disheveled than usual, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights. He was holding a book, but she could tell he hadn't been reading it. His fingers were clenched around the cover like he was using it as an anchor. "Susan?" His voice was hoarse with exhaustion. "What are you doing here?" For a moment, Susan's courage deserted her entirely. Harry Potter looked so young sitting there, despite everything he'd been through, despite all the responsibility that had been heaped on his shoulders. How could she walk into his sanctuary and shatter whatever peace he'd managed to find? But then she thought of Aunt Amelia's letter, of the urgency in her aunt's careful handwriting, of the terrible possibility that Harry had been suffering in silence for years, while the very people who should have protected him looked the other way. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice stronger than she felt, "about something important." Harry's expression grew wary. "If this is about the DA, it's not." Susan moved closer, choosing a chair across from his. "It's about you, about your family, about where you lived before Hogwarts." The change in Harry was immediate and stark. His entire body went rigid, and his hand tightened on the book until his knuckles went white. "I don't talk about the Dursleys." "I think you need to," Susan said gently. "Harry, I received a letter from my aunt 3 days ago. She's been investigating something, and I think you have a right to know what she found." Harry stared at her for a long moment, and Susan could see him weighing his options. She knew she was asking him to trust her with something painful, something private. They weren't close friends. They moved in different circles, despite both being in the DA. But sometimes, she thought, it was easier to share your secrets with someone who wasn't already invested in seeing you as a hero. "What kind of investigation?" Harry asked finally. Susan took a shaky breath. "An investigation into your placement with your relatives. Harry, my aunt found evidence that Professor Dumbledore received multiple reports about your treatment at the Dursleys' house. Reports from neighbours, from teachers, from social workers, and he ignored them all." The silence that followed was so complete that Susan could hear her own heartbeat. Harry had gone very still, and his face had taken on a carefully blank expression that she recognized from his interactions with Umbridge, a mask he wore when he needed to protect himself. "That's impossible," he said quietly. "Is it?" Susan leaned forward. "Harry, When you came to Hogwarts your first year, how much did you weigh? Something flickered in Harry's eyes. Pain, quickly suppressed. I don't see how that's relevant. Madam Pumphrey keeps records of all students' health examinations. My aunt accessed them as part of her investigation. You were severely underweight when you arrived at Hogwarts, and you had multiple healed fractures that were never properly treated. Broken ribs, a broken wrist, fingers that had been snapped and healed crooked. Susan's voice grew gentler. Someone hurt you, Harry. And according to my aunt's investigation, Professor Dumbledore knew about it. Harry stood up abruptly, nearly knocking over his chair. He walked to the fireplace and stood with his back to her, his shoulders tense. You don't understand. The blood protection, my mother's sacrifice, required you to live with your aunt, not to be abused by her family. Susan's words cut through the room like a blade. Harry, there's a difference between keeping you safe and leaving you in a house where you were starved and beaten. Stop! Harry's voice was raw. Just stop. But Susan couldn't stop, not now that she'd started. My aunt found correspondence between Dumbledore and ministry officials, letters discussing how your treatment needed to remain appropriate to your circumstances, and how your gratitude needed to be properly cultivated. Harry, they knew. They all knew, and they decided it was acceptable because it served their purposes. Harry turned around, and Susan was shocked by the anguish in his face. Their purposes? To make sure you would be grateful when the wizarding world came to rescue you. To make sure you wouldn't ask too many questions about why they needed you to fight their battles. To make sure you'd be willing to sacrifice yourself when the time came. The words felt like poison on Susan's tongue. You were supposed to be thankful for any scrap of kindness they threw your way, because you'd known nothing but cruelty before. Harry sank back into his chair like his strings had been cut. How long have you known about this? 3 days. Since I got my aunt's letter. Susan reached into her robes and pulled out the crumpled parchment. She was going to present formal charges against Dumbledore and the ministry officials who enabled your abuse. But then her investigation was discovered, and now... Now what? Susan's throat felt tight. I haven't heard from her since she sent this letter. She's never gone 3 days without contacting me, Harry. Something's happened to her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with implications. Harry stared into the fire, his green eyes reflecting the dancing flames. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Tell me about the reports she found. Susan felt her heart break a little at the resignation in his tone. There were dozens of them, spanning years. A teacher at your primary school filed a report when you came to class with a black eye and claimed you'd fallen down the stairs. Neighbors called social services multiple times about a child screaming in the middle of the night. A postal worker reported that mail addressed to you was being returned to sender or burned in the garden. Harry's hands clenched into fists. The letters from Hogwarts. Among others, yes. Someone was systematically ensuring you remained isolated from any support system, any proof that you belonged somewhere else. Susan pulled her chair closer. Harry, there are photographs, documentation of injuries, medical reports that were mysteriously lost or altered in the Muggle system. And through it all, correspondence between Dumbledore and ministry officials discussing your progress and whether the conditioning was taking properly. Conditioning? Harry's voice was hollow. They conditioned me. To be grateful, to be self-sacrificing, to never question authority or demand better treatment. Susan reached out tentatively and touched Harry's hand. To be willing to die for people who never protected you when you needed it most. Harry didn't pull away from her touch, but Susan could feel him trembling. I used to dream about being rescued, he said quietly. When I was little, locked in the cupboard, I'd imagine that someone would come and take me away to somewhere safe. And then Hagrid came, and I thought it was real. I thought someone had finally cared enough to save me. Someone did care, Susan said fiercely. My aunt cared. That's why she was investigating. That's why she put herself in danger to uncover the truth. But not the people who were supposed to care. Harry's laugh was bitter. Not the ones who put me there in the first place. Susan squeezed his hand. We can make them care now. We can make them face what they've done. Harry looked at her then, really looked at her, and Susan saw something shift in his expression. Why are you telling me this? Why risk getting involved? It was a fair question. Susan had been asking herself the same thing all evening. Because it's right, she said simply. Because you deserved better. And because my aunt died, trying to get you justice. Died? Harry's eyes widened. Susan, you said you hadn't heard from her. I know my aunt, Harry. She wouldn't disappear voluntarily. Not in the middle of an investigation this important. If she's not responding to my letters, it's because she can't. Susan's voice broke slightly. Someone wanted her silenced, and I think we both know who has the most to lose if this evidence becomes public. Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. Dumbledore wouldn't. He couldn't. Couldn't he? Susan challenged gently. Harry, think about everything you've learned about him this year. The secrets he's kept, the information he's withheld, the way he's manipulated situations to get the outcomes he wanted. Is it really so hard to believe that he'd eliminate a threat to his reputation? He's fighting Voldemort, Harry said weakly. He's trying to protect people. By sacrificing children? By leaving them in abusive situations because it serves his greater good? Susan shook her head. Harry, that's not protection. That's calculation. And you were the variable he needed to control. Harry stood up again and began pacing, his agitation clear in every line of his body. If this is true, if any of this is true, then everything I believed about him, about why I'm here, about my purpose. He trailed off, running his hands through his hair. Then you get to choose for yourself what your purpose is, Susan said quietly. For the first time in your life, you get to decide what Harry Potter means, instead of letting other people define it for you. But how do we prove it? How do we make anyone believe this without your aunt's testimony? Susan reached into her robes again and pulled out a small brass key. She hid copies of everything. In my family vault at Gringotts, in a secure location at the ministry that only she knew about, and in one other place she didn't specify in the letter. We can get the evidence, Harry. We can make sure the truth comes out. Harry stopped pacing and stared at the key in her palm. And then what? Even if we expose Dumbledore, even if we prove what happened to me, what difference does it make? The damage is already done. The difference, Susan said, standing and moving closer to him, is that you'll know you're not responsible for what happened to you. You'll know that the people who should have protected you made a choice to let you suffer. And that choice says nothing about your worth and everything about their failure. Harry's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. You are, Susan said with quiet certainty. You're the strongest person I know, Harry Potter. And this time, you won't have to be strong alone. He looked at her then with something like wonder, as if he'd never considered the possibility that someone might stand beside him without expecting him to carry them. Why would you do this? Help me, I mean. We barely know each other. Susan smiled, the first genuine smile she'd managed since receiving her aunt's letter. We're about to know each other very well. And Harry? After what I've learned about how the adults in our world treat children who inconvenience them, I think it's time we started protecting each other. Harry nodded slowly, and Susan saw something shift in his posture, a straightening of his shoulders, a lifting of his chin. For the first time since she'd known him, Harry Potter looked like he was preparing to fight for himself instead of for everyone else. When do we start? He asked. Susan looked down at the key in her hand, thinking of her aunt's urgent words, of Harry's years of suffering, of all the children who might be suffering still, while the adults who should protect them looked the other way. "Tomorrow," she said. "We start tomorrow." The room of requirement seemed to pulse around them, the walls shifting subtly to accommodate their new purpose. Where before it had been a sanctuary, now it felt like a war room. And perhaps, Susan thought, that's exactly what they needed it to be. Because tomorrow they would begin the most important battle of their lives, not against dark wizards or dangerous creatures, but against the system that had failed them both, the adults who had put their own agenda above the welfare of children, and the terrible silence that had allowed abuse to flourish in the shadows. Tomorrow they would start fighting for the truth. But tonight, for the first time, in longer than either of them could remember, neither Harry Potter nor Susan Bones felt quite so alone. Outside the castle, the first hints of dawn were beginning to touch the edges of the sky, and somewhere in the distance an owl called out across the grounds, a sound that might have been mournful or might have been hopeful, depending on how you chose to hear it. Susan chose hope. Chapter 2. The Weight of Truth. Harry sat in stunned silence for a long time after Susan finished speaking, staring at the brass key she'd placed on the table between them. The fire in the room of requirement had burned lower while they talked, casting dancing shadows across the walls that seemed to shift and writhe like living things. The revelation about Dumbledore's knowledge of his abuse should have felt shocking, earth-shattering, but instead it settled into Harry's chest with the dull weight of something he'd always known, but never allowed himself to acknowledge. Of course Dumbledore had known. Of course the great Albus Dumbledore, with his network of spies and informants, his careful orchestration of events, his ability to appear wherever he was needed most, had known exactly what was happening at Number 4 Privet Drive. The only shocking thing, Harry realized with bitter clarity, was that he'd ever believed otherwise. "Harry?" Susan's voice was gentle, cautious. "Are you all right?" He almost laughed at the question. Was he all right? He was the boy who lived, the chosen one, the savior of the wizarding world. He was supposed to be all right by definition. But sitting here in the pre-dawn darkness, with the comfortable lies of his childhood crumbling around him, Harry felt more lost than he had since that first night in the cupboard under the stairs. "I remember being so hungry," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not just Mr. Meal hungry, but the kind of hungry that makes you dizzy and sick. I used to sneak downstairs at night and drink water from the tap just to put something in my stomach." Susan's face crumpled with sympathy, but she didn't interrupt. Harry found himself grateful for her silence. He didn't think he could bear pity right now, but her quiet presence felt like an anchor in the storm of his memories. "The cupboard was so small," he continued, the words coming easier now that he'd started. "I could barely stretch out fully, even when I was little. And it was dark, so dark that sometimes I couldn't tell if I had my eyes open or closed. They'd lock me in there for days sometimes. No food, no water, no toilet breaks, just darkness and hunger and the sound of them moving around upstairs, living their normal lives while I tried not to exist." "How long did this go on?" Susan asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Years." Harry's laugh was hollow, brittle. "From the time I was old enough to remember until I left for Hogwarts. They called it discipline, said I was a freak who needed to be taught his place. And I believed them, you know. I thought I must have done something terrible to deserve it, even if I couldn't remember what." He stood up abruptly, needing to move, needing to do something with the restless energy that was building under his skin. The room around them seemed to sense his agitation, the walls shifting to accommodate his pacing. "The worst part," Harry said, his voice growing stronger with anger, "wasn't the hunger or the beatings or even the cupboard. It was the hope. Every time someone looked at me with concern, a teacher, a neighbor, a shop clerk, I thought maybe this would be the time someone would help. Maybe someone would finally see what was happening and take me away from there." But no one ever did, Susan said softly. No one ever did, Harry confirmed. They'd ask questions sometimes. How did you get that bruise, Harry? Why are you so thin? Are you happy at home? And I'd lie. I always lied, because the Dursleys made it very clear what would happen if I told the truth. But part of me hoped. God, I was so pathetic. Part of me hoped that someone would see through the lies. You weren't pathetic, Susan said fiercely. You were a child. You deserved to have someone see through the lies. Harry stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her. Susan Bones had always seemed like background noise to him. A quiet Hufflepuff who did well in classes and minded her own business. But sitting here in the firelight, with her brown hair falling loose around her shoulders and her eyes bright with righteous anger on his behalf, she looked like something entirely different. She looked like someone who might actually fight for him. According to your aunt's investigation, Harry said, settling back into his chair, someone did see through the lies. Multiple someones, in fact. They just chose not to act on what they saw. Susan nodded grimly and reached into her bag, pulling out a folder thick with parchments. This is just a sample of what Aunt Amelia found. She made copies of everything before hiding the originals. She opened the folder and pulled out the first document. This is a report filed by your Year 2 teacher at Little Whinging Primary School. Harry's heart stopped. Mrs. Henderson? You remember her? She was kind to me. She used to keep biscuits in her desk drawer and slip them to me when she thought no one was looking. Harry's throat felt tight. She noticed I was hungry. Susan's expression grew pained as she read from the report. Child appears severely malnourished and shows signs of physical abuse. Multiple bruises in various stages of healing, consistent with repeated beatings. Student claims injuries are result of clumsiness, but pattern suggests systematic abuse. Child hoards food from school meals and becomes agitated when asked about home life. Recommend immediate intervention by Child Protective Services. She filed that report? Harry asked, his voice cracking. She filed 3 reports over the course of the year you were in her class. All of them disappeared from the social services files within days of being submitted. Susan pulled out another document. But Aunt Amelia found copies in a separate file, along with correspondence from the ministry. She handed him a letter, written on official ministry letterhead, and Harry felt his world tilt sideways as he read Dumbledore's familiar, flowing script. Dear Mrs. Caldwell, I write regarding the reports filed concerning young Harry Potter's welfare. While I appreciate the concern shown by the teaching staff at Little Whinging Primary, I must stress that intervention in this case would be most unwise. The boy's circumstances, while appearing harsh to outside observers, are necessary for his protection and development. The blood magic that shields him requires specific conditions to remain effective, and any disruption to his living situation could prove catastrophic. Furthermore, it is essential that young Harry remain humble and grateful for any kindness shown to him. A childhood of ease and comfort would ill prepare him for the trials he must face. Please ensure that no further reports are filed regarding this matter. Yours sincerely, Albus Dumbledore, Order of Merlin, First Class. Harry read the letter twice, then a third time, each pass making him feel sicker. Blood magic, he said finally. He's talking about my mother's protection. Keep reading, Susan said quietly. Harry looked down at the letter again, and saw there was more, written in a different hand at the bottom. Note: Mrs. Caldwell transferred to different department following this correspondence. All subsequent reports regarding Potter child to be redirected to my attention and filed under classified status. A. Crouch. Barty Crouch Sr., Susan explained. He was head of international magical cooperation at the time, but apparently he had a side arrangement with Dumbledore. Every report about you went straight to him, and he made sure they disappeared. Harry set the letter down with shaking hands. They weren't just ignoring the abuse, they were actively covering it up. It gets worse. Susan pulled out another set of documents. These are medical records from the few times you were taken to hospital. A broken wrist when you were 6, 3 cracked ribs when you were 8, a concussion when you were 9. I remember those, Harry said numbly. Uncle Vernon always had a story ready. I fell off my bike. I fell down the stairs. I ran into a door because I wasn't watching where I was going. The doctors didn't believe him, Susan said. Look at this note from the emergency room physician who treated your broken wrist. She handed him a Muggle medical form covered in careful handwriting. Harry read the doctor's notes with growing horror. Patient presents with spiral fracture of left radius, consistent with twisting injury. Father claims child fell from bicycle, but injury pattern does not match mechanism described. Child is extremely thin for age and shows signs of chronic malnutrition. Multiple healed fractures visible on X-rays, including ribs and fingers. Pattern strongly suggests ongoing physical abuse. Child refuses to speak when questioned about home environment and shows extreme fear response when father enters room. Recommend immediate social services intervention. They called social services, Harry said. They called social services, who came to investigate and found nothing wrong because they were given false information by ministry operatives posing as neighbors. Susan's voice was bitter. According to the files, a team of obliviators was dispatched every time there was an official inquiry into your welfare. They modified memories, altered records, and created false witnesses to support the Dursleys' stories. Harry felt like he was drowning. How many people knew about the abuse? Based on what my aunt found, at least 20 ministry employees were directly involved in the cover-up. As for who knew but didn't act, Susan gestured helplessly. The Order of the Phoenix had members watching you periodically. Mrs. Figg was reporting on your activities. Professor McGonagall was at Privet Drive the night you were placed there, and saw enough to have concerns about the Dursleys' character. McGonagall knew. The betrayal of that hit Harry like a physical blow. Professor McGonagall, strict but fair, who had always seemed to care about her students' welfare. She knew, and she left me there anyway. According to the transcripts my aunt found, she raised objections to Dumbledore on multiple occasions, but she was told that your placement was non-negotiable and that questioning Dumbledore's decision was tantamount to putting you in mortal danger. Harry buried his face in his hands, trying to process the magnitude of what Susan was telling him. It wasn't just that he'd been abused, it was that his abuse had been orchestrated, protected, and justified by the very people who claimed to care about his welfare. Every adult who should have helped him had instead chosen to serve Dumbledore's greater good. There's more, Susan said gently. Harry, I know this is overwhelming, but you need to see all of it. More. Harry looked up at her, feeling hollowed out and fragile. How can there possibly be more? Susan pulled out a thick sheaf of letters tied with a black ribbon. These are correspondence between Dumbledore and various ministry officials discussing your conditioning. Conditioning. The word felt sour in Harry's mouth, like I was an animal to be trained. Not trained, shaped. Susan untied the ribbon and spread several letters across the table. Read this one. It's from Dumbledore to Cornelius Fudge, dated 6 months after you started Hogwarts. Harry picked up the letter with numb fingers and began to read. My dear Cornelius, I am pleased to report that young Harry's development continues according to plan. His placement with the Dursleys has achieved precisely the effect we intended. He is grateful for any kindness shown to him, unquestioning of authority figures, and possessed of a deep-seated need to prove his worth through self-sacrifice. The boy's experience of neglect and abuse has made him extraordinarily empathetic to suffering, which will serve him well in the trials to come. More importantly, Harry has formed no lasting attachments that might interfere with his ultimate purpose. He cares deeply for his friends, of course, but maintains enough emotional distance to function independently when necessary. This careful balance between isolation and connection has been delicate to maintain. but I believe we have achieved the optimal result. As we discussed, Harry's willingness to face death will be crucial to our success. A child who had known love and security from birth might hesitate when the moment comes to make the ultimate sacrifice. Harry's background ensures that he will view his own death as a small price to pay for the welfare of others. Indeed, I suspect he may welcome the opportunity to finally prove himself worthy of the love that was so long denied to him. The boy's rescue complex is developing beautifully. He cannot resist rushing to the aid of anyone he perceives as vulnerable, regardless of the danger to himself. This trait, combined with his survivor's guilt over his parents' deaths, makes him the perfect weapon against Tom. I remain confident that our investment in Harry's suffering will yield the desired results when the final confrontation occurs. Yours truly, A. Dumbledore. Harry finished reading and let the letter fall from nerveless fingers. The room around them had gone completely silent, except for the soft crackling of the fire. He felt like someone had reached into his chest and torn out his heart. "He planned it all," Harry said, his voice barely audible. "Everything that happened to me, everything I became, it was all part of his plan." "Harry!" "The rescue complex," Harry interrupted, his voice growing stronger with anger. "Rushing to help vulnerable people, regardless of danger to myself. That's exactly what I do, isn't it? Every year, every crisis, I throw myself into danger because I can't bear to see other people suffer." "That's not a weakness," Susan said fiercely. "Your compassion, your willingness to help others. Those are good things, Harry. They're who you are." "But are they who I am or who I was made to be?" Harry stood up again, his hands clenched into fists. "How do I know which parts of my personality are real and which parts are just the result of systematic emotional manipulation?" He thought about every time he'd rushed headlong into danger to save someone else. The Philosopher's Stone, the Chamber of Secrets, the Triwizard Tournament, the Department of Mysteries. In every case, he'd been driven by an overwhelming need to protect others, even at the cost of his own safety. He'd always thought it was just who he was. But now he wondered if it was simply the inevitable result of 11 years of conditioning that taught him his own life had no value except in service to others. "Harry," Susan said, standing and moving closer to him. "Look at me." He met her eyes reluctantly, expecting to see pity or disgust. Instead, he saw steady, unwavering conviction. "You are not broken," she said firmly. "You are not a weapon. You are not the product of their manipulation. Yes, what they did to you was horrific and wrong, and it shaped you in ways it shouldn't have. But the person you became, in spite of that, your kindness, your loyalty, your courage, those things came from you. From some part of yourself that they couldn't touch, no matter how hard they tried." "How can you be so sure?" Harry asked desperately. "Because I've seen you with your friends. I've seen the way you laugh at the twins' jokes, the way you help Neville with his potions, the way you worry about people who are hurting. That's not conditioning, Harry. That's love. That's choosing to be kind, even when kindness wasn't shown to you." Harry felt tears pricking at his eyes and tried to blink them away. "But what if you're wrong? What if I'm exactly what Dumbledore made me to be? A perfect little sacrifice who'll walk willingly to his death because he was trained to believe that's all he's good for." "Then we'll find another way," Susan said simply. "We'll break the conditioning. We'll help you remember who you are underneath all the lies they told you about yourself. And how exactly do you propose we do that?" Susan picked up the brass key from the table and held it out to him. "We get the rest of the evidence. We expose what they did to you, what they're still doing to other children. We make sure that no one else suffers the way you did, because the adults who should protect them decided their pain was acceptable collateral damage." Harry stared at the key, feeling the weight of decision pressing down on him. Taking that key would mean crossing a line he could never uncross. It would mean declaring war on the people he'd spent 5 years learning to trust, accepting that his entire understanding of his place in the world had been built on lies. But it would also mean that maybe, finally, someone would be held accountable for what had been done to him. Maybe other children wouldn't have to endure what he had endured. Maybe he could find out who Harry Potter really was underneath all the careful manipulation and conditioning. "There's something else," Susan said quietly. "Something in the last letter my aunt sent me that I haven't told you yet." "What?" "She thinks your rescue by Hagrid wasn't the beginning of Dumbledore's plan. She thinks it was the culmination of it." Susan's voice was barely above a whisper. "Harry, she found evidence that Dumbledore knew about the prophecy before your parents died. She thinks he let them die specifically so that you would become the weapon he needed you to be." The room went completely silent. Harry felt like all the air had been sucked out of his lungs, like the ground had opened up beneath his feet and he was falling through empty space. "That's impossible," he managed to say. "He loved my parents. He was their friend." "Was he?" Susan pulled out one final letter, this one yellowed with age. "This is correspondence between Dumbledore and an unnamed correspondent, dated 2 weeks before your parents' deaths." Harry took the letter with hands that shook so badly he could barely hold it steady. "The die is cast. James and Lily have chosen to trust Peter with their location, despite my subtle encouragements toward other options. Peter's loyalty to Tom ensures that the Potter family's location will be revealed within days. I confess to some regret about the necessity of this course of action. James and Lily are good people who deserve better than the fate that awaits them, but their sacrifice will serve a greater purpose. Their son will be forged in the crucible of loss and suffering that will make him into the weapon we need. The boy must lose everything before he can be molded into the savior the wizarding world requires. Love and security would make him soft, reluctant to make the hard choices that lie ahead. But a child raised in darkness will welcome any light offered to him, and will fight to protect that light, no matter the cost to himself. I pray that history will vindicate our choices, even as I acknowledge the terrible price we are asking James and Lily to pay." Harry read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully sank in. When it did, he felt something fundamental break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper, something that had been holding the core of his identity together. Dumbledore hadn't just known his parents would die. He had orchestrated their deaths, had maneuvered them into trusting the wrong person, had ensured that Voldemort would find them, had sacrificed them on the altar of his greater good, all so that Harry would become exactly the kind of broken, grateful, self-sacrificing weapon that Dumbledore needed. "Oh God," Harry whispered. And then he was on his knees, retching onto the floor as 11 years of carefully suppressed grief and rage and betrayal poured out of him all at once. Susan was beside him immediately, her hand rubbing circles on his back as he sobbed. She didn't try to comfort him with empty words or false reassurances. She simply stayed with him while he fell apart, her presence a steady anchor in the storm of his anguish. When the worst of it had passed, when Harry's sobs had faded to exhausted hiccups, he looked up at Susan with red-rimmed eyes. "They killed them," he said hoarsely. "They killed my parents, and then they handed me over to people who would torture me, all so I would grow up to be the perfect little martyr." "Yes," Susan said simply. "They did. And everyone knows. McGonagall, Snape, probably half the Order. They all know that I'm not really a hero. I'm just a victim they've been grooming for slaughter." "Some of them know," Susan agreed. "Others might suspect. But Harry, that doesn't make you less of a hero. It makes what you've accomplished even more extraordinary." "How can you say that?" Harry asked bitterly. "Everything I've done, every choice I've made, it's all been manipulation." "No," Susan said firmly. "The manipulation was what was done to you. Your response to that manipulation, choosing kindness over cruelty, love over hate, protection over revenge, that was all you. They tried to break you, Harry, and you refused to be broken. They tried to make you into a weapon, and instead you became someone who protects people. Harry wanted to believe her, but the doubt was like poison in his veins. How could he trust any of his own motivations when they might all be the result of careful conditioning? How could he know if his love for his friends was real or just another product of Dumbledore's manipulation? "What do we do now?" he asked, because he didn't know what else to say. Susan stood and extended her hand to help him up. "Now we get the evidence. We expose the truth. And we make sure that no one else ever has to go through what you went through." Harry looked at her outstretched hand for a long moment, then took it and let her pull him to his feet. Standing there in the flickering firelight, surrounded by the scattered evidence of his systematic abuse and betrayal, Harry Potter made a decision that would change everything. He was done being anyone's weapon. He was done being grateful for scraps of kindness from people who had orchestrated his suffering, and he was done protecting a system that saw children as acceptable casualties in their war. It was time to fight back. "All right," he said, his voice steady for the first time since Susan had started reading the letters. "Let's go get that evidence." Outside the room of requirement, dawn was breaking over Hogwarts, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. But inside the room, Harry Potter and Susan Bones were just beginning to understand how dark the world really was, and how much work lay ahead of them to bring it into the light. The brass key gleamed on the table between them, a promise of truth and a threat of consequences. But for the first time in his life, Harry was more interested in the truth than he was afraid of the consequences. It was, Susan thought, as she watched him straighten his shoulders and lift his chin, exactly the kind of courage that couldn't be manufactured or conditioned. It was the kind that came from deep within, from the part of a person that refused to be broken, no matter how much pressure was applied. And perhaps, she thought, that was the most dangerous thing of all to the people who had tried so hard to control him. They had created their perfect weapon, but in doing so, they had also forged their own destruction. Because Harry Potter was done being anyone's victim, and he was just beginning to learn how to be his own hero. Chapter 3. The Hidden Files. The room of requirement had transformed around them as the morning light grew stronger outside the castle. What had been a cozy sitting room with a fireplace now resembled something closer to a war room. The walls lined with maps, the table expanded to accommodate the scattered documents, and additional chairs appearing as if the room itself understood the gravity of what they were planning. Harry sat across from Susan, methodically organizing the evidence they'd already reviewed into neat piles. It was easier to focus on the mechanical task of sorting papers than to dwell on the contents of those papers, on the systematic destruction of his childhood that they documented in careful, clinical detail. His hands were steady now, though Susan noticed the tight set of his jaw and the way his eyes had gone distant and cold. "There's more," Susan said quietly, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for the better part of an hour. "What I've shown you, it's only a fraction of what Aunt Amelia discovered." Harry's hands stilled on the papers he was sorting. "How much more? Enough to destroy more than just Dumbledore's reputation?" Susan pulled the brass key from her pocket and set it on the table between them. "Enough to bring down half the ministry, if we're willing to go that far." "Tell me about the locations where she hid the evidence," Harry said, his voice carefully neutral. Susan recognized the tone. It was the same one he used during Umbridge's classes, when he was fighting to keep his emotions under control. "3 places," Susan said, settling back in her chair. "The family vault at Gringotts, which we can access with this key. A secure location somewhere in the ministry that only she knew about. She was paranoid about ministry security, so she created her own hiding place. And..." She hesitated, then continued. and somewhere she called the place where the truth lives, which I think might be her personal study at home. The Bones family manor. What's left of it? Susan's voice grew heavy. After most of my family was killed in the First War, Aunt Amelia had the main house sealed. Too many memories, she said. But she kept a small cottage on the grounds where she went when she needed to think. If she was going to hide something precious, something that could change everything, that's where she'd put it. Harry nodded slowly. 3 locations. 3 chances to retrieve evidence that could expose not just what was done to me, but what's being done to other children. Is that what you want to do? Susan asked carefully. Expose all of it? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Harry understood what she was really asking. Was he prepared to tear down the entire system that had failed him, even if it meant destroying innocent people who were simply following orders? Was he willing to risk the stability of the wizarding world in the middle of a war just for the sake of justice? I don't know, Harry admitted. Yesterday I would have said no. The war against Voldemort is too important to risk internal chaos. But now, he gestured at the scattered papers, how can I trust a system to fight for the innocent when it's built on the systematic abuse of children? How can I ask people to follow leaders who view child suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business? Susan leaned forward, her brown eyes intense. There's something else you need to understand. Harry, this isn't just about you. Aunt Amelia didn't start investigating because she was concerned about one abused child. She started investigating because she suspected there were more. More. Harry felt something cold settle in his stomach. More children like me? More children placed in carefully orchestrated situations designed to shape them into weapons. Susan pulled out a thin file she hadn't shown him before. Preliminary investigations into unusual custody arrangements for other orphaned children from wizarding families, children whose magical guardians died under suspicious circumstances, children who ended up with Muggle relatives despite having magical family members who could have taken them in. Harry's hands clenched into fists. How many? At least a dozen that Aunt Amelia identified before her investigation was discovered. Possibly more. Susan opened the file and spread out several custody documents. Look at the signatures, Harry. Look who approved these placements. Harry scanned the papers, and his blood ran cold. Dumbledore's signature appeared on every single document, sometimes as Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, sometimes as head of the International Confederation of Wizards, sometimes simply as an advisor to the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, though why that department would be involved in custody decisions was unclear. He's been doing this for decades, Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. Creating broken children who would grow up to be willing martyrs. That's what Aunt Amelia believed, and she was building a case not just against Dumbledore, but against everyone who enabled him. Susan pulled out another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. This is her preliminary report to the minister. She was going to present it the week after her murder. Harry took the document with unsteady hands and began to read. Classified investigation, unauthorized distribution, prohibited Department of Magical Law Enforcement, preliminary report on suspected child welfare violations, ***, submitted by Amelia S. Bones, Department Head, ***. After extensive investigation spanning 6 months, this department has uncovered evidence of systematic child abuse facilitated and concealed by high-ranking ministry officials. The scope of the violations includes, but is not limited to: 1. Deliberate placement of orphaned magical children with abusive guardians despite availability of suitable magical family members. 2. Systematic suppression of reports documenting child abuse and neglect, ***. 3. Memory modification of Muggle authorities investigating child welfare concerns, ***. 4. Falsification of medical and social services, records 5, intimidation and transfer of ministry employees who raised concerns about child welfare. The evidence suggests these violations were not the result of administrative oversight or bureaucratic incompetence, but rather a deliberate policy designed to psychologically condition vulnerable children for future exploitation. Principal subjects of investigation: Albus Dumbledore, Chief Warlock, ICW Supreme Mugwump; Cornelius Fudge, Minister for Magic; Barty Crouch, Senior; Department of International Magical Cooperation, **** Dolores Umbridge, Senior Undersecretary to the Minister, ****, redacted, redacted, recommended actions, ***1. Immediate suspension of all named individuals pending full investigation, ***2. Emergency review of all child custody arrangements approved by the named individuals, ***3. Establishment of Independent Oversight Committee for Child Welfare, ***4. Full audit of Department of Magical Law Enforcement practices regarding Muggle Authority interaction. Given the seriousness of these allegations and the potential for evidence destruction, I recommend this investigation proceed with utmost secrecy until arrests can be coordinated. Respectfully submitted, Amelia Susan Boneshead, Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Harry finished reading and set the document down carefully, as if it might explode. She was going to arrest Dumbledore. She was going to arrest all of them, Susan corrected. The entire network that enabled decades of systematic child abuse. And now she's dead. And now she's dead, Susan agreed quietly. Which means it's up to us to finish what she started. Harry was quiet for a long time, staring at the brass key that would unlock the next phase of their investigation. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and determined. "Tell me about your family," he said. "Tell me about the Bones family's history with Dumbledore." Susan seemed surprised by the change of subject, but she settled back in her chair and considered the question. "What do you want to know?" "You said your family always suspected something was wrong with my placement. That suggests they knew something about Dumbledore's methods even before your aunt's investigation. I want to understand how far back this goes." A shadow passed over Susan's face. "It goes back to before you were born, Harry. Before the First War even ended." She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts, and when she spoke again, there was a weight to her words that spoke of long-held family secrets. "My grandfather was Edgar Bones. He was my aunt's older brother and my father's father. He was also a member of the original Order of the Phoenix." Susan's voice grew heavy with old grief. "Voldemort killed him and my grandmother and my uncle personally, along with their children. My father was the only one who survived, and only because he wasn't home that night." "I'm sorry," Harry said quietly. "I know what it's like to lose family to Voldemort." "Do you?" Susan asked, and there was no accusation in her voice, only genuine curiosity. "Because I've always wondered if you really understood what happened to your parents, or if you only knew the story Dumbledore told you." The question caught Harry off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean that my grandfather didn't die because Voldemort randomly decided to target the Bones family. He died because he discovered something that threatened Dumbledore's plans, and Dumbledore arranged for him to be in a vulnerable position when Voldemort came calling." Harry felt the now familiar chill of betrayal settle in his chest. "What did he discover?" Susan stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the grounds of Hogwarts. "My grandfather was investigating missing children, magical children who disappeared from their families and were later found dead, or who simply vanished without a trace. He suspected that someone was deliberately targeting vulnerable magical families to eliminate potential threats to some larger plan." "The same pattern your aunt discovered," Harry said, pieces clicking into place. "Exactly the same pattern. Grandfather found evidence that children from prominent magical families were being systematically removed, either through targeted killings or through carefully orchestrated custody arrangements that placed them with abusive guardians. Susan turned back to face him. He also found evidence that someone was feeding information about Order safe houses to Death Eaters. A spy in the Order. Multiple spies, and at least one of them was feeding information directly to Dumbledore about which families were asking inconvenient questions about missing children. Susan's voice grew bitter. My grandfather was getting close to identifying the network, so Dumbledore arranged for him to be on duty at a safe house that had been deliberately compromised. Harry felt sick. Dumbledore set him up to be killed. That's what my family has always believed. We could never prove it, of course. Dumbledore's too clever for that. But the timing was too convenient, and there were too many small details that didn't add up. Susan returned to her chair, her expression grim. My father spent years trying to find proof of what really happened, but every lead disappeared, every potential witness died, or had their memory modified. So when your aunt started investigating my situation, she was finishing what our family started decades ago, trying to prove that Albus Dumbledore is not the benevolent leader everyone believes him to be, but rather a manipulator who views children as expendable resources in his greater game. Harry absorbed this information, feeling the weight of generational trauma and injustice. Why didn't your family ever go public with their suspicions? Susan laughed bitterly. Go public with what? Accusations against the most beloved wizard in Britain, the man who defeated Grindelwald, the leader of the resistance against Voldemort? Without proof, all we had were the paranoid theories of a grieving family. Who would have believed us? But your aunt was in a position to gather proof. My aunt was in a position to access records that previous generations of our family couldn't reach, and she had the credibility to make accusations that would be taken seriously. Susan's expression grew pained. She also had something else, a personal connection to one of Dumbledore's victims who might actually be believed if he chose to speak out. Me, Harry realized. You, the boy who lived, speaking out against Dumbledore, that would carry weight in a way that accusations from the Bones family never could. Susan pulled out another letter from her bag. This is the last letter I received from Aunt Amelia, the night before she disappeared. She was planning to approach you directly. Harry took the letter and read, Dearest Susan, tomorrow I will attempt to speak with Harry Potter about what we've discovered. I know this is dangerous. For him, for me, for our family. But I can no longer stand by while children suffer because of one man's twisted vision of the greater good. If something happens to me before I can complete this investigation, I need you to understand that Harry Potter is not the only victim. There are other children, Susan. Other broken souls being shaped into weapons for Dumbledore's war. Some of them may not survive the conditioning. Some of them may already be lost. The evidence we've gathered must reach the right people. Not just any people, the right people. Those who care more about protecting children than protecting their own positions. I believe Harry Potter might be one of those people if he can overcome the programming that's been instilled in him since childhood. But Susan, if I don't survive this, you must promise me something. You must promise that you won't try to finish this alone. Find allies. Find people you can trust, and above all, remember that the truth is more important than any one person's reputation, no matter how exalted. With all my love and hope for a better future, Aunt Amelia P.S. If you're reading this because something has happened to me, look for the letter I left in the hidden compartment of my desk. It contains instructions for accessing the vault and the password to my private files. But more importantly, it contains a list of people who might be willing to help, if approached carefully. Harry set down the letter and looked at Susan with new understanding. She was murdered before she could approach me." "She was murdered because she was going to approach you," Susan corrected. "Someone found out about her plans and decided she was too dangerous to live." "How do we know it wasn't Voldemort or his Death Eaters?" "Because of how she died." Susan's voice grew very quiet. "Aunt Amelia was one of the most powerful witches of her generation, Harry. She'd survived multiple assassination attempts during the First War. She was paranoid about security, had wards on her home that rivaled those on Gringotts, and she never went anywhere without multiple layers of protection. But she was killed in her own study, at her desk, with no signs of struggle, no forced entry, no evidence of battle, no indication that she even tried to defend herself." Susan's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "She was killed by someone she trusted, someone who was able to get close enough to strike before she realized the danger." Harry felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "Someone from the Order. Someone who reports directly to Dumbledore. That's what I think. And I think whoever killed her took the original files from her study before the Aurors arrived to investigate. Which means the copies she hid are now the only evidence we have." The weight of what they were contemplating settled over them like a heavy blanket. They weren't just talking about exposing past crimes anymore. They were talking about hunting down a murderer who was still active, still dangerous, and still protected by the most powerful wizard in Britain. "The Hogsmeade weekend," Harry said finally. "When is it?" "This Saturday, 3 days from now." "And you're certain we can access your family vault with that key?" Susan nodded. "Aunt Amelia set up emergency access protocols years ago, after what happened to the rest of our family. She was always paranoid that the family line might be targeted again, so she made sure I'd be able to access our resources even if something happened to her." Harry stood and began pacing again, his mind working through the logistics of what they were planning. "Gringotts first, then. We get whatever evidence she hid there, and we use that to figure out how to access the other locations safely." "Harry," Susan said quietly, "are you sure about this? Once we take that evidence from the vault, there's no going back. We'll be committed to this path, wherever it leads." Harry stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her. Susan Bones, who had lost most of her family to a war they were supposedly winning. Susan Bones, who had risked everything to approach him with the truth about his past. Susan Bones, who was offering to stand beside him against the most powerful forces in their world. "What's the alternative?" he asked. "Let Dumbledore continue using children as weapons. Let other families be destroyed the way yours was, the way mine was. Let the truth stay buried while more innocents suffer. The alternative," Susan said carefully, "is that you go back to being Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the chosen one. You fulfill the role Dumbledore created for you. You defeat Voldemort, save the wizarding world, and probably die in the process, but die as a hero, with everyone believing you chose your fate freely. And the children who come after me? What happens to them?" Susan was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she admitted finally. "Then we go to Gringotts," Harry said with finality. "We get the evidence, and we decide what to do with it once we know the full scope of what we're dealing with." Susan nodded and stood, gathering the scattered papers from the table. "There's one more thing you should know before we commit to this path." "What?" "The list of people Aunt Amelia thought might be willing to help. It's not a long list, and some of the names on it might surprise you." "Such as?" Susan hesitated, then pulled out one final piece of parchment. "This is a copy of her private notes about potential allies, people she thought we could trust with the truth." Harry took the parchment and scanned the short list of names written in Amelia Bones' careful handwriting. Potential allies in child welfare investigation: Minerva McGonagall, conflicted but fundamentally decent; Severus Snape, victim of similar manipulation; Kingsley Shacklebolt, uncorrupted, high integrity; Arthur Weasley, naive but genuinely protective of children. Remus Lupin, guilt-ridden, might be motivated by desire for redemption. Luna Lovegood sees truth others miss, not yet fully indoctrinated. Neville Longbottom, shared trauma, natural protective instincts. Do not trust. Molly Weasley, too close to Dumbledore, compromised judgment. Any current Order members, except those listed above. Ministry officials, except Kingsley. Anyone connected to the Hogwarts Board of Governors. Harry stared at the list, surprised by some of the inclusions and exclusions. She thought Snape would help us? She thought Snape was another victim of Dumbledore's manipulation. Something about his history with your mother. The way Dumbledore has used his guilt to control him. Susan shrugged. I don't know the details, but Aunt Amelia believed that Snape might be motivated to help if he understood that Dumbledore had been manipulating him the same way he manipulated you. And she didn't trust Mrs. Weasley? Too close to Dumbledore, too invested in seeing him as a benevolent father figure. Aunt Amelia thought that anyone who was that emotionally attached to Dumbledore would be unable to accept evidence of his crimes, no matter how compelling. Harry folded the list carefully and tucked it into his robes. We'll start with Gringotts, then we'll decide who to approach based on what we find there. Agreed. Susan gathered the rest of her papers and returned them to her bag. Harry, there's one more thing. Something personal I need to tell you before we go any further with this. What? Susan took a deep breath, as if gathering courage for a difficult confession. This investigation, this quest for justice, it's not just about doing the right thing for me. It's about family honor. It's about finishing what my grandfather and my aunt died trying to accomplish. Harry nodded, understanding. Revenge. Justice, Susan corrected firmly. But yes, there's an element of personal satisfaction involved. I want to see Dumbledore face consequences for what he's done to our families. I want him to pay for my aunt's death, for my grandfather's death, for all the children who suffered because of his greater good. And you're worried that my motivations aren't as pure? Susan smiled ruefully. I'm worried that my motivations aren't as pure. I'm worried that I'm using your legitimate grievances to pursue my family's vendetta. I need you to know that going in, so you can make an informed decision about whether to trust me. Harry considered this for a moment, then reached out and took her hand. Susan, if someone killed the people who should have protected me, if someone used me as a weapon while pretending to be my mentor, if someone orchestrated my parents' deaths and then profited from my suffering, I'd want revenge too. The fact that you're honest about it makes me trust you more, not less. Even if it means we might not be objective about the evidence we find. Especially then, because Dumbledore is counting on our objectivity, on our willingness to give him the benefit of the doubt, on our desire to believe that he's fundamentally good despite evidence to the contrary. Harry squeezed her hand. He's not counting on two angry children who are willing to burn down his reputation to protect other children from suffering the way we did. Susan squeezed back, and for the first time since this conversation began, she smiled with genuine warmth. Partners in revenge, then? Partners in justice, Harry corrected, echoing her earlier words, with a healthy serving of well-deserved revenge on the side. They stood together in the middle of the room of requirement, surrounded by evidence of crimes that stretched back decades, holding hands like co-conspirators planning a revolution, which, Harry supposed, was exactly what they were. Outside, the morning sun had risen fully over Hogwarts, painting the castle in golden light. But inside the room of requirement, Harry Potter and Susan Bones were just beginning to understand how much darkness lay hidden beneath that beautiful facade. In 3 days, they would walk into Gringotts and retrieve evidence that could change everything. They would cross a line from which there was no return, committing themselves to a path that would make them enemies of some of the most powerful people in the wizarding world. But for the first time in his life, Harry Potter wasn't walking toward danger alone. And for the first time since her aunt's death, Susan Bones felt like she had a real chance of getting justice for her family. Together, they might actually be strong enough to tear down the lies and expose the truth. Together, they might finally be able to protect the children who came after them from suffering the way they had suffered. The brass key gleamed on the table between them, a promise of answers and a threat of consequences. But neither of them was afraid anymore. They had work to do. Chapter 4. Dangers in the Shadows. The morning of the Hogsmeade trip dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of sharp autumn air that made every breath feel like it could cut glass. Harry stood at the window of his dormitory, watching students stream across the grounds toward the village, their voices carrying on the wind like distant music. It should have been a normal Saturday, the kind of day he might have spent browsing honeydukes with Ron and Hermione, or nursing a butterbeer at the Three Broomsticks while complaining about Snape's latest impossible assignment. Instead, he was preparing to commit what amounted to theft and conspiracy against some of the most powerful people in the wizarding world. The brass key Susan had given him felt heavy in his pocket, its weight a constant reminder of what they were about to attempt. 3 days had passed since their conversation in the Room of Requirement, 3 days of careful planning and nervous preparation. They had rehearsed their story. Susan needed to retrieve personal effects from her family vault. Harry was providing moral support as a friend, until it sounded natural, believable. What they hadn't been able to rehearse was the fear. Harry pulled on his heaviest cloak and made his way down to the common room, where he found Hermione and Ron waiting for him, with expressions of barely contained curiosity. "You're sure you don't want to come with us to Zonko's?" Ron asked for the 3rd time that week. "Fred and George gave me a list of products they want me to test for them. Could be fun." "I'm sure," Harry said, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "I promised Susan I'd help her with something at Gringotts. Family business." Hermione's sharp eyes studied his face with the intensity of someone trying to solve a particularly complex arithmancy equation. "Harry, you've been acting strange all week. Are you sure everything's all right?" The question hit closer to home than Harry could afford to acknowledge. Everything was emphatically not all right, and hadn't been since Susan had shown him the truth about his childhood. But he couldn't explain that to his best friends. Not yet, not when he didn't know how far the corruption extended, not when he couldn't be sure who else might be watching him. "I'm fine," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "Just tired. You know how it is with Umbridge breathing down our necks all the time." Ron nodded sympathetically, but Hermione continued to frown. "If something was wrong, you'd tell us, wouldn't you? We're your friends, Harry. We want to help." The sincere concern in her voice made Harry's chest tighten with guilt. These were his best friends, the people who had stood by him through everything, and here he was lying to them because he couldn't risk them getting caught up in something that might destroy their faith in everything they believed about the wizarding world. "Of course I would," Harry said, adding another lie to the growing pile. "But really everything's fine. I'll see you tonight at dinner." He escaped the common room before they could ask any more questions, but the weight of their concern followed him through the corridors like a shadow. By the time he reached the entrance hall, where Susan was waiting with a small group of other students preparing to leave for Hogsmeade, Harry felt like he was carrying the guilt of the entire wizarding world on his shoulders. Susan looked up as he approached, and Harry saw his own tension reflected in the tight set of her jaw and the careful way she held herself. She was dressed in travelling robes of deep blue wool, with her hair pulled back in a practical braid. But there was something in her posture that spoke of a soldier preparing for battle, rather than a student going on a recreational trip to the village. "Ready?" she asked quietly, and Harry nodded. They joined the stream of students heading toward the village, walking close enough to appear to be having a casual conversation, while actually reviewing their plan in hushed tones. "The Gringotts branch office is at the far end of High Street," Susan murmured, her voice barely audible over the chatter of their classmates. "We'll separate from the main group once we reach the village centre, then approach the bank from the side street to avoid being seen by too many people. "What about afterward?" Harry asked. "If we find what we're looking for, we'll need somewhere private to examine it." "There's a safe house," Susan said, then caught herself. "Not a safe house exactly. More like a cottage that used to belong to my family. It's been empty since the war, but the wards are still active. We should be able to review the evidence there without being disturbed." Harry nodded, trying to project an air of casual confidence he didn't feel. Around them, their fellow students chatted and laughed, excited about their day of freedom from Hogwarts's increasingly oppressive atmosphere. None of them seemed to notice that Harry Potter and Susan Bones were walking through their midst like actors in a play, rehearsing lines for a performance that could get them killed if they forgot their cues. The walk to Hogsmeade passed in a blur of nervous energy and forced normalcy. Harry found himself cataloguing every detail of their surroundings, the way the autumn light fell through the bare branches of the trees, the crisp sound of leaves crunching under dozens of pairs of feet, the distant smoke rising from the chimneys of the village ahead. It felt like the kind of hyper-awareness that came with approaching danger, though he couldn't say what exactly he was afraid of. As they reached the outskirts of Hogsmeade, Susan touched his arm gently. "We need to be more careful now," she said quietly. "If someone is watching us, this is where they'll make their move." "Watching us?" Harry looked around, but saw only the familiar sights of the village, shops opening their doors to welcome the weekend influx of students, the smell of fresh pastries wafting from the bakery, the warm glow of windows against the autumn chill. "Do you see something specific?" "No," Susan admitted. But Aunt Amelia always said that the absence of obvious surveillance was often the most dangerous kind. The watchers you can't see are the ones who are good at their job. They separated from the main group of students as planned, ducking down a narrow side street that wound between the backs of shops toward the Gringotts branch office. The alley was empty, except for a few stray cats and the occasional pile of discarded crates, but Harry found himself checking over his shoulder every few steps. "There," Susan said, pointing to a modest stone building with the distinctive goblin architecture that marked it as a Gringotts facility. The branch office handles smaller transactions for people who can't make the trip to London. Family vault access, minor investment management, that sort of thing. They approached the building carefully, Harry's hand instinctively moving to his wand. The street was quiet, except for the distant sounds of the village centre, but something about the silence felt wrong, as if they were walking into a trap that hadn't been sprung yet. The goblin teller who greeted them inside the bank was polite but thorough, examining Susan's key and identification documents with the kind of meticulous attention that made Harry's palms sweat. After what felt like an eternity, the goblin nodded and gestured for them to follow. "Emergency vault access," the goblin said in his gravelly voice. "Most unusual for one so young. You understand that such access is only granted in cases of documented emergency?" "My aunt's death qualifies, I believe," Susan said with quiet dignity. "She specifically instructed me to retrieve certain personal items in the event of her passing." The goblin nodded again and led them through a series of corridors that seemed to stretch much deeper into the building than its modest external dimensions would suggest. Harry had been in Gringotts many times, but he'd never visited a branch office, and he was struck by how similar the atmosphere was to the main London facility, the same sense of ancient magic, the same feeling of being in the presence of beings far older and more dangerous than they appeared. The Bones family vault was smaller than Harry's, but no less impressive. The walls were lined with safety deposit boxes, filing cabinets, and several chests that hummed with protective enchantments. Susan moved through the space with the confidence of someone who had been here before, heading directly to a particular cabinet marked with her aunt's initials. "Here," she said, pulling out a thick folder sealed with red wax. "This is what Aunt Amelia wanted us to find." Harry took the folder with hands that shook slightly, feeling the weight of secrets and evidence that could change everything. But before he could examine the contents, A sound from the corridor outside made both of them freeze. Voices. Low, urgent voices, speaking in tones that suggested they didn't want to be overheard. Told you they would come here eventually. The girl couldn't resist completing her aunt's work. And Potter? A useful tool, if properly motivated. The Dark Lord has plans for the boy. Plans that don't involve him learning too much about his precious mentor's true nature. Harry felt ice water run through his veins. Death Eaters. They had been followed, watched, and now they were trapped in an underground vault with enemies between them and the exit. Susan's face had gone pale, but her voice remained steady. "The emergency exit," she whispered, pointing to a small door hidden behind a tapestry. "Aunt Amelia showed me when I was younger. It leads to the old tunnel system beneath the village." Harry nodded, clutching the folder against his chest. They moved toward the hidden door as quietly as possible, but the sound of their footsteps seemed impossibly loud in the confined space of the vault. The voices in the corridor were getting closer. "Won't expect us to take them alive. The girl knows too much, and Potter is becoming more trouble than he's worth. The Dark Lord wants Potter brought to him, alive. The Dark Lord wants many things. Sometimes circumstances require us to be creative in our interpretation of his orders." Harry pulled the invisibility cloak from his bag and threw it over both of them, just as the vault door began to creak open. Through the shimmering fabric, he could see two figures in dark robes entering the vault, their faces hidden by masks, but their movements clearly those of people comfortable with violence. Susan guided him toward the emergency exit, her knowledge of the bank's layout proving invaluable as they navigated between the storage containers without making a sound. The folder crinkled softly in Harry's arms, and he found himself terrified that even that small noise would give them away. The hidden door opened onto a narrow tunnel carved from the living rock beneath Hogsmeade. The passage was dark and damp, with the musty smell of earth and old magic, but it represented safety from the immediate threat above. They moved through the tunnel as quickly as they dared, Susan leading the way through a maze of passages that seemed to connect the basements of half the buildings in the village. Harry could hear the Death Eaters behind them, their frustrated voices echoing off the stone walls as they searched the vault and realized their quarry had escaped. "This way," Susan whispered, turning down a passage that sloped upward toward what Harry hoped was an exit. "We're almost there." They emerged through a hidden panel in the cellar of what appeared to be an abandoned shop, climbing a rickety staircase to ground level. Through grimy windows, Harry could see they were on the outskirts of the village, in what looked like the old merchant district, where several businesses had closed during the war. "The cottage is just ahead," Susan said, leading him through a narrow gap between buildings. "We should be safe there long enough to examine what we found." But as they rounded the corner, Harry saw something that made his blood run cold. Two more figures in dark robes were standing outside a small cottage that must be their destination, clearly waiting for them to arrive. "They knew," Harry said quietly. "Somehow, they knew exactly where we were going." Susan's face was grim. "Which means they know about the cottage, about the vault, probably about everything Aunt Amelia discovered. We're not just being followed, Harry. We're being hunted by people who understand our mission better than we do." They backed away from the cottage, keeping to the shadows as they tried to figure out their next move. The folder in Harry's arms felt heavier with each passing moment, weighted not just with paper, but with the knowledge that people were willing to kill to keep its contents secret. "There," Susan said, pointing to another building across the street. "The old Bones family shop. It's been closed since my grandfather died, but I still have the key. The upper floors should be safe." They made their way carefully across the street, using every shadow and doorway to avoid being seen by the watchers at the cottage. Harry's heart was pounding so hard he was sure it could be heard 3 streets away. But somehow they managed to reach the shop without being detected. The interior was dusty and filled with the ghosts of old memories, display cases that had once held magical artifacts, shelves that had been lined with books and potions, a counter where Susan's grandfather had conducted the business that eventually got him killed. Susan led Harry up a narrow staircase to a small apartment above the shop, where they finally felt safe enough to examine their prize. The folder contained more than Harry had expected. Along with the documents they had already seen, reports of abuse, correspondence between Dumbledore and Ministry officials, evidence of systematic cover-ups, there were new files that painted an even more disturbing picture. "Look at this," Susan said, spreading out a map that showed locations throughout Britain. Aunt Amelia was tracking patterns of suspicious deaths and disappearances. All of these families had children who fit a specific profile. Harry studied the map, seeing red pins scattered across England, Scotland, and Wales. Each pin represented a family that had been destroyed, children who had been orphaned, or who had simply vanished without explanation. "What kind of profile?" he asked. "Magical children from old bloodlines, children with unusual abilities or significant potential, children whose parents had been asking inconvenient questions about ministry policies." Susan pulled out a thick file of case notes. "Aunt Amelia believed that someone has been systematically eliminating threats to a long-term plan that goes back decades." Harry felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air seeping through the building's old windows. "A plan to do what?" "To control the next generation of magical leaders. To ensure that the children who grow up to hold power in the wizarding world are the right kind of children. Broken, grateful, malleable. Children who will never question authority because they've been conditioned from birth to believe that authority is the only thing protecting them from chaos." The implications of what Susan was suggesting hit Harry like a physical blow. "You're saying this isn't just about me. You're saying there's been a deliberate campaign to shape an entire generation." "Look at this list," Susan said, handing him another document. "Children who were removed from loving magical families and placed with abusive Muggle relatives. Children whose magical guardians died under suspicious circumstances. Children who were sent to institutions that specialized in correcting difficult behavior." Harry scanned the list and felt sick. There were dozens of names, children he'd never heard of who had suffered fates similar to his own. Some had survived their conditioning and gone on to become productive members of Wizarding Society. Productive, compliant, grateful members who never questioned the system that had broken them. Others hadn't survived at all. "This is genocide," Harry said quietly. "Not the quick, violent kind that Voldemort practices, but something slower and more insidious. The systematic destruction of independent thinking in magical children." "And it's been going on for decades," Susan agreed. "Long enough that some of the victims are now in positions of authority themselves, perpetuating the cycle without even realizing they're doing it." Harry thought of all the adults he'd encountered in the wizarding world, teachers, ministry officials, order members, and wondered how many of them had been shaped by similar experiences to his own. How many of them were victims of this same system, carrying out orders from superiors they'd been conditioned to never question. "The Death Eaters who were following us," he said suddenly. "They weren't just trying to stop us from exposing Dumbledore. They were trying to get this information for Voldemort." Susan nodded grimly. "Because Voldemort understands what this represents. If he can prove that Dumbledore has been systematically abusing children for decades, if he can show the wizarding world that their beloved leader is no better than a Death Eater himself, then he wins," Harry finished. "Not through violence, but through destroying people's faith in the institutions that oppose him." They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their discovery settling over them like a heavy blanket. The folder between them contained enough evidence to destroy Dumbledore's reputation, to bring down half the ministry, to shatter the wizarding world's faith in its leaders. But using that evidence would also hand Voldemort the greatest propaganda victory in the history of the war. "What do we do?" Susan asked quietly. Harry stared out the window at the village below, where students from Hogwarts were enjoying a normal Saturday afternoon, blissfully unaware that their world was built on the systematic abuse of children. Some of those students might themselves be victims of the conditioning Susan's aunt had uncovered. Others might be future victims, if nothing was done to stop the cycle. "We have to be smart about this," he said finally. "We can't just dump this information into the Daily Prophet and hope for the best. We need to find a way to expose the truth without handing Voldemort a victory." "How?" Harry was quiet for a long moment, thinking through their options. "We need allies. People who can't be dismissed as conspiracy theorists or bitter children with grudges against authority. We need someone with credibility, someone the wizarding world trusts. Most of the people the wizarding world trusts are either part of this system or too invested in it to accept the truth," Susan pointed out. "Then we find the exceptions, the people who care more about protecting children than protecting their own positions." Harry picked up the folder and held it carefully, as if it might explode. "And we make sure we have all the evidence before we make our move. Your aunt hid information in 3 places, remember? We've only retrieved 1 cache." Susan nodded slowly. "The ministry location and the cottage." "Exactly. We need the complete picture before we decide how to proceed. And we need to do it before the Death Eaters figure out where the other hiding places are." "That's assuming we can stay ahead of them," Susan said. "They knew exactly where we were going today, Harry. They knew about the vault, about the cottage, probably about our entire plan. That suggests they have access to information that should have been known only to my aunt." Harry felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in his mind. "Or they have access to someone who knew your aunt's plans." "What do you mean?" "I mean that someone told them we would be at Gringotts today. Someone who knew about our investigation. Someone your aunt trusted enough to share her plans with." Harry's voice grew hard. "Someone who's been feeding information to both sides." Susan's face went pale as the implications sank in. "A double agent?" "A double agent who's close enough to Dumbledore to know about the evidence, and close enough to Voldemort to arrange for Death Eaters to intercept us." Harry stood and began pacing the small room. "Someone who has access to Order communications and Death Eater planning sessions." "Snape," Susan said immediately. Harry considered this, then shook his head. "Too obvious. And besides, if Snape wanted us dead, we'd be dead. He's had plenty of opportunities over the years." He paused, thinking. "No, this is someone else. Someone who benefits from keeping both sides in conflict while positioning themselves as indispensable to whoever wins." "Do we have any way to find out who?" Harry looked down at the folder in his hands, then at Susan's determined face, and felt something crystallize in his mind. They were no longer just trying to expose the truth about his childhood. They were hunting a traitor who had been playing all sides for their own benefit, someone who was willing to see children murdered to protect their position. "We set a trap," he said quietly. "We feed different information to different people and see which version reaches the Death Eaters. But first, we need to retrieve the rest of your aunt's evidence. We need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Susan stood and moved to the window, checking the street below for signs of surveillance. "The Death Eaters have given up watching the cottage. They probably think we're long gone by now." "Good. Then we wait until dark and try to access the other hiding places." Harry joined her at the window. "But Susan, you need to understand something. After today, after what we've learned, there's no going back. We're committed to this path, wherever it leads." "I know," she said quietly. "And I'm ready for whatever comes next." Harry looked at her profile against the window, at the determined set of her jaw, and the steady way she held herself, despite everything they'd been through that day. Susan Bones was no longer the quiet Hufflepuff who had approached him in the room of requirement. She was becoming something harder, more dangerous, forged in the crucible of truth and betrayal. "Together?" he asked. "Together," she confirmed. Outside, the sun was beginning to set over Hogsmeade, painting the village in shades of gold and amber. But Harry and Susan barely noticed the beauty of the evening light. They were too busy planning their next move in a war that had suddenly become much more complex and dangerous than either of them had imagined. The folder of evidence lay between them on the dusty table, its contents representing both their greatest weapon and their greatest vulnerability. In the wrong hands, it could destroy everything they were fighting for. In the right hands, it could save an entire generation of magical children from suffering the way they had suffered. The question was, which hands were the right ones? As darkness fell over the village, Harry Potter and Susan Bones prepared to find out. The hunt for truth was about to become a hunt for traitors, and the stakes had just gotten higher than either of them had ever imagined. But they were no longer the frightened, isolated children they had been when this journey began. They were something new, something dangerous, something that the people who had shaped them had never intended them to become. They were survivors who refused to stay victims, and they were just getting started. Chapter 5. Unlikely Allies. The return to Hogwarts that evening felt like stepping back into a different world. After the danger and revelation of their trip to Hogsmeade, the familiar stone corridors and flickering torchlight seemed almost surreal in their normalcy. Students were scattered throughout the common areas, chatting about their day in the village, comparing purchases from honeydukes and zonkos, complaining about homework assignments that felt monumentally trivial compared to what Harry and Susan had discovered. Harry sat in the Gryffindor common room, the weight of the evidence they'd retrieved pressing against his consciousness like a physical burden. The folder was safely hidden in his trunk, protected by every ward and concealment charm he could manage, but he could feel its presence as if it were radioactive. Every few minutes, his hand would drift unconsciously toward his dormitory, checking to make sure their secrets were still secure. Ron and Hermione had been waiting for him when he returned, full of questions about his day with Susan and increasingly concerned by his obvious distress. Harry had managed to deflect their inquiries with vague mentions of family business and emotional difficulties, but he could see that his explanations weren't satisfying them. Hermione, in particular, was watching him with the kind of intense scrutiny that suggested she was preparing to launch a full investigative assault. "Harry, you're acting like someone died," Ron said, looking up from his chess game with Seamus. "What exactly did you and Susan do in Hogsmeade? Visit a funeral parlour?" "It's complicated," Harry said, for what felt like the 100th time that evening. "Family stuff. Personal stuff. Nothing I can really talk about." Hermione closed her book with a sharp snap that made several nearby students look up in alarm. "Harry James Potter, you have been lying to us for a week. Don't think we haven't noticed. You disappear for hours at a time. You're constantly distracted during lessons, and now you're spending entire days with Susan Bones doing mysterious family business that you can't explain to your best friends." The accusation hit too close to home, and Harry felt his temper flare. "Maybe I have a right to some privacy, Hermione. Maybe not everything in my life needs to be shared with the entire Gryffindor common room." "This isn't about privacy," Hermione shot back, her voice rising enough that several other students began to pay attention. "This is about you shutting us out when you obviously need help. We're your friends, Harry. We've stood by you through everything: the Triwizard Tournament, the Ministry Smear campaign, Voldemort's return, and now you're acting like we can't be trusted with whatever's bothering you." Ron looked uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking, but he nodded in agreement with Hermione. "She's right, mate. We've been through too much together for you to start keeping secrets now." Harry felt trapped between his loyalty to his friends and his knowledge that what he'd learned could destroy their faith in everything they believed about the wizarding world. How could he explain that their beloved Professor Dumbledore had orchestrated decades of child abuse? How could he tell them that the Order of the Phoenix they so admired was built on systematic cover-ups and manipulation? "Some secrets aren't mine to share," he said finally. "Some things are bigger than just my personal problems." "Then let us help," Hermione insisted. Whatever this is about, whatever you've discovered, you don't have to handle it alone." The earnest concern in her voice made Harry's chest tighten with guilt. These were his best friends, the people who had risked everything to stand by his side, and here he was lying to them because he didn't know how to explain that their entire world was built on lies. Before he could formulate a response, the portrait hole swung open and Susan entered the common room, her face tense with urgency. She scanned the room until she spotted Harry, then approached with careful steps that suggested she had important news. "Harry," she said quietly, "could I have a word? It's about the project we've been working on." Hermione's eyes sharpened with suspicion. "What project? What exactly have you two been working on that's so secretive?" Susan glanced between Harry and his friends, clearly weighing her options. After a moment, she seemed to come to a decision. "Perhaps you should ask Harry about that. But Hermione, Ron, you might want to consider whether you're really prepared to hear the truth." "What kind of truth?" Ron asked, his expression growing serious. Susan looked at Harry, seeking permission. When he nodded reluctantly, she took a deep breath and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "The kind of truth that could change everything you believe about the people you trust most." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Harry could see the moment when Hermione and Ron realized that this wasn't about typical teenage drama or relationship complications. This was something that could have real consequences, something that could shatter the comfortable certainties they'd built their worldview around. "I think," Hermione said slowly, "we need to have this conversation somewhere more private." They made their way to the room of requirement in tense silence, the weight of unspoken secrets making every step feel heavy. Once inside the room, which had configured itself as a comfortable study with privacy charms and sound-dampening spells, Harry found himself facing his best friends across a small table with Susan beside him as moral support. "All right," Hermione said, settling into her chair with the determined expression she wore when approaching a particularly challenging research problem. "Tell us everything." Harry looked at Susan, who nodded encouragingly, then took a shaky breath. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to hear. It's going to challenge everything you think you know about Dumbledore, about the Order, about my childhood and my place in this war." "Harry," Ron said quietly, "you're scaring us." "Good," Harry replied with bitter honesty, "because what we've discovered is terrifying." Over the next hour, Harry and Susan laid out everything they had learned. They showed Ron and Hermione the evidence of systematic cover-ups, the correspondence proving Dumbledore's knowledge of Harry's abuse, the broader pattern of child exploitation that stretched back decades. They explained about Amelia Bones's murder, about the Death Eaters who had hunted them in Hogsmeade, about the double agent who was feeding information to both sides. The reaction was exactly what Harry had feared. Hermione's face cycled through shock, denial, anger, and finally a kind of nauseated understanding as she processed the implications of what they were telling her. But when Harry finished speaking, when the last piece of evidence had been presented and explained, she shook her head with violent determination. "No," she said firmly. "I don't believe it. I can't believe it. Professor Dumbledore is the greatest wizard of our time, the leader of the resistance against Voldemort. He's saved countless lives, protected countless people. The idea that he would deliberately abuse children, that he would orchestrate your parents' deaths, it's impossible." "Hermione," Harry began. "No, Harry, I know you've been through terrible things. I know your childhood was awful, but that doesn't mean there was some grand conspiracy. Sometimes terrible things happen because people make mistakes, not because there's an evil mastermind pulling strings." Ron looked torn between his loyalty to Harry and his agreement with Hermione's assessment. "It does seem a bit far-fetched, mate. I mean, Dumbledore's been fighting dark wizards longer than any of us have been alive. Why would he suddenly start acting like one?" "He hasn't suddenly started," Susan said, her voice tight with frustration. "He's been doing this for decades. The evidence is right there in front of you." "Evidence can be faked," Hermione said, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. "Documents can be forged. Maybe someone wants you to believe these things about Professor Dumbledore. Maybe this is all part of Voldemort's plan to divide us." Harry felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper. Some fundamental trust in the people he cared about most. "So you think I'm lying? You think Susan and I made all of this up?" "I think you're hurting," Hermione said gently. "And I think someone is taking advantage of that hurt to turn you against the people who care about you most." The dismissal in her voice, the implication that he was too damaged to think clearly about his own experiences, hit Harry like a physical blow. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "Right," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I'm just a traumatized child who doesn't know what's real and what isn't. I suppose the years of starvation and beatings were just my imagination too." "Harry, that's not what I meant." "Isn't it?" Harry's anger was building, fed by months of suppressed rage and betrayal. "Because that's exactly what everyone has been telling me my entire life, that my memories of abuse aren't reliable, that the adults who were supposed to protect me always had good reasons for letting me suffer, that I should be grateful for any scraps of kindness I received, because I obviously didn't deserve better." Ron reached out, as if to calm him. "Mate, we're not saying—" "You're saying exactly what Dumbledore trained you to say," Harry interrupted. "You're defending him because you can't bear to accept that your hero might be a monster. Well, here's something for you to consider. Maybe the reason you can't accept it is because you've been conditioned not to question authority figures, just like I was." Hermione's face went pale. "You're accusing us of being brainwashed?" "I'm suggesting that you examine why you're so willing to dismiss evidence of child abuse when it implicates someone you admire." Harry's voice was cold now, cutting. "I'm suggesting that your first instinct to protect Dumbledore's reputation over my welfare tells us everything we need to know about where your loyalties really lie." The room fell silent, except for the harsh sound of Harry's breathing. He knew he was being unfair, knew he was letting his anger speak for him instead of his rational mind, but he couldn't stop himself. The betrayal of his friend's reaction felt like yet another confirmation that he was truly alone in this fight. Susan stood and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Harry, they need time to process this. It's not easy to accept that everything you believed about someone was wrong." "Is it?" Harry asked, looking directly at Hermione and Ron. "Or is it just inconvenient?" Before either of them could respond, the door to the room of requirement opened, and Luna Lovegood drifted in as if she belonged there, her dreamy expression more focused than usual. "Hello," she said in her ethereal voice. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but the room told me you needed help." "Luna?" Hermione looked confused by the interruption. "How did you even know we were here?" "The castle talks to those who listen," Luna replied, settling into an empty chair without waiting for an invitation. "And it's been very concerned about Harry and Susan lately. All those dark creatures circling, all those secrets weighing on young minds." Harry studied Luna's face, seeing something in her pale eyes that suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "What kind of dark creatures?" "The kind that feed on fear and doubt," Luna said, her voice taking on an unusually serious tone. "The kind that grows stronger when people refuse to see the truth that's right in front of them." She pulled a worn journal from her bag and set it on the table between them. "My father has been investigating corruption in the ministry for months. He's found evidence of systematic cover-ups, memory modifications, and deliberate suppression of information that would expose certain officials' crimes." Hermione leaned forward despite herself. "What kind of crimes?" "The kind involving children," Luna said simply. "The kind that powerful people commit when they think no one is watching, or when they convince themselves that the greater good justifies individual suffering. Harry felt a chill of recognition. Your father found evidence of the same pattern Susan's aunt discovered. Not quite the same, Luna corrected, but parallel, complementary, like pieces of a puzzle that only make sense when you see them together. She opened the journal and revealed pages of careful notes, newspaper clippings, and official documents. Father started investigating after a friend of his, a man named Edgar Bones, was killed for asking too many questions about missing children. Susan gasped. Your father knew my grandfather? They worked together, briefly, during the First War. Both of them were trying to trace what happened to magical children whose families had been targeted by Death Eaters. They discovered that not all of those children actually died in the attacks. Some were taken, some were placed in specific situations designed to shape their development. Luna's revelation hung in the air, adding another layer to the conspiracy they had already uncovered. Harry felt pieces clicking into place, connections forming between events he had never linked before. What happened to your father's investigation? Susan asked. He learned to be more careful, Luna said, with matter-of-fact honesty. After Edgar Bones died, Father realized that asking too many direct questions was dangerous. So he started investigating indirectly, following paper trails and bureaucratic inconsistencies instead of approaching potential victims directly. She pulled out a map similar to the one they had found in Amelia Bones's evidence, but marked with different colored pins. Red pins are confirmed disappearances of magical children. Blue pins are children who were orphaned and then placed with non-magical relatives, despite having magical family available. Yellow pins are locations where ministry obliviators were deployed to modify memories related to child welfare investigations. Harry studied the map and felt his stomach drop. The pattern was clear, undeniable, stretching across decades and encompassing hundreds of children. This is genocide, he said quietly. Cultural genocide. They're systematically destroying the next generation's ability to think independently. Or creating a generation of perfect soldiers, Luna agreed. Broken, grateful soldiers who will never question orders because they've been conditioned to believe that authority figures are the only thing standing between them and chaos. Ron, who had been silent throughout Luna's presentation, finally spoke up. Even if this is all true, and I'm not saying it is, what are we supposed to do about it? We're just students. We can't take on the Ministry and Dumbledore and whoever else is involved in this. We can start by not pretending it isn't happening, Harry said sharply. We can stop protecting the people who profit from child abuse just because it's inconvenient to acknowledge their crimes. Harry, Hermione said, her voice strained, I understand that you're angry, and you have every right to be. But rushing into accusations without being completely certain, how much certainty do you need? Susan interrupted. How much evidence is enough? Because we have documents, correspondence, medical records, witness testimony, and corroborating investigations from multiple sources. What else would convince you that Harry's suffering was deliberate and systematic? Hermione was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across the table. When she spoke again, her voice was very small. I need to see the original documents. I need to verify the authenticity of the correspondence. I need to understand how this evidence was gathered and by whom. It wasn't the immediate acceptance Harry had hoped for, but it wasn't complete denial either. You'll examine the evidence objectively, even if it means accepting that Dumbledore isn't who you thought he was? I'll examine it, Hermione agreed reluctantly. But Harry, you have to understand, if we're wrong about this, if we're being manipulated into believing lies about Professor Dumbledore, we could be helping Voldemort win this war. And if we're right, Harry countered, and we do nothing, we're allowing the systematic abuse of children to continue while pretending we're fighting for justice. Before the argument could escalate further, the door opened again, and Neville Longbottom entered, his round face flushed with exertion as if he had been running. Harry, he said breathlessly, I need to talk to you. About your childhood, about what happened to you at your relative's house. The room went completely silent. Neville rarely spoke about personal matters, and his sudden appearance seemed too coincidental to be accidental. "What about my childhood?" Harry asked carefully. Neville closed the door behind him and activated privacy charms with a competence that surprised everyone present. "Because I think the same things happened to me. Different details, different people, but the same purpose." He sat down heavily in the remaining chair, his hands shaking slightly as he gathered his courage to speak. "My parents aren't just suffering from the effects of the Cruciatus curse," he said quietly. "That's what everyone believes, what my grandmother always told me. But it's not the whole truth. They were subjected to experimental mind-healing techniques that were supposed to repair the damage from the torture. Techniques that were supposed to help them recover their memories and personalities." "Supposed to?" Susan prompted gently. "The treatments made them worse. Much worse. And the healers who administered those treatments knew it would happen. They documented it, studied it, used my parents as test subjects to develop more effective methods of psychological conditioning." Neville's words hit Harry like a physical blow. "Who authorized the treatments?" "The same committee that approved your placement with the Dursleys. The same people who decided that my parents' suffering was an acceptable cost of advancing their research." Neville pulled out a folder of his own, his movements careful and deliberate. "I've been investigating this for months, ever since I overheard a conversation between my grandmother and Madame Pomfrey about appropriate therapeutic responses to trauma." He spread out medical records and official correspondence that bore disturbingly familiar signatures. "They've been using my parents as long-term test subjects, Harry. Trying different combinations of memory charms and behavioral modification techniques to see if they can create the perfect victim. Someone who remembers enough trauma to be compliant, but not enough detail to be troublesome." Luna leaned forward to examine the documents. "Your grandmother knows about this?" "My grandmother has been complicit in it from the beginning," Neville said with quiet bitterness. "She believes that any suffering is justified if it serves the greater good, even the suffering of her own family." The revelation that Neville's beloved grandmother, the fierce, protective woman who had raised him after his parents' incapacitation, was part of the same system that had failed, Harry felt like another piece of a horrible puzzle clicking into place. "How many of us are there?" Ron asked, his voice hollow with dawning understanding. "How many students at Hogwarts are here because we've been systematically shaped into weapons?" "More than you'd think," Luna said sadly. "The Sorting Hat doesn't just place students based on their natural personalities. It places them based on their potential usefulness to specific objectives. Brave, loyal soldiers in Gryffindor, cunning, ambitious leaders in Slytherin, reliable, unquestioning supporters in Hufflepuff, intelligent, research-focused assets in Ravenclaw. You're saying we were sorted based on how we could be used?" Hermione asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm saying the Sorting Hat has access to children's memories and traumatic experiences," Luna replied. "It knows which students have been conditioned for specific purposes and places them accordingly." Harry felt the world tilting around him as he processed the implications. Not only had his abuse been deliberate, but his placement in Gryffindor House, his friendships, his entire Hogwarts experience had been orchestrated to serve someone else's agenda. "This is insane," Ron said, standing up abruptly. "You're talking about a conspiracy involving the entire school, the Ministry, the Order, everyone we've ever trusted. Do you realize how paranoid that sounds? Do you realize how naive you sound?" Harry shot back. "Ron, we have evidence. We have documentation. We have multiple independent sources confirming the same pattern of abuse and manipulation. At what point do you stop calling it paranoia and start calling it pattern recognition?" Ron's face flushed red with anger and confusion. "I don't know what to believe anymore. This morning I thought I knew who the good guys were and who the bad guys were. Now you're telling me that everyone I've looked up to my entire life has been lying to me. that my best friend has been systematically tortured since childhood, and that Hogwarts itself is some kind of training facility for creating perfect victims? Maybe that's exactly what you need to accept, Susan said quietly. Maybe the reason this feels so overwhelming is because you've been conditioned not to question authority figures, just like the rest of us. Before Ron could respond, the door burst open and Hannah Abbott rushed in, followed by Ernie Macmillan and Justin Finch Fletchley. All three Hufflepuffs looked frightened and determined in equal measure. "Susan," Hannah said breathlessly, "we need to warn you. Professor Umbridge has been asking questions about you, about where you've been spending your time, who you've been talking to, what kind of family business you've been conducting." Ernie nodded grimly. "She cornered me after herbology, and wanted to know everything I could tell her about your recent behavior. When I said I didn't know anything specific, she implied that I should start paying closer attention to my housemates' activities." "She's building a case against you," Justin added, "or gathering intelligence for someone else who is." Harry felt ice water run through his veins. "How much does she know?" "Enough to be suspicious," Hannah replied. "She knows you've been meeting with Harry regularly. She knows you left the castle during the Hogsmeade trip, and she knows you've been accessing private areas of the school during unusual hours." "The Room of Requirement," Susan said with dawning horror. "She knows about the Room of Requirement." "Worse," Ernie said grimly. "She knows about the DA meetings that used to happen here. She's been investigating everyone who was associated with Dumbledore's army, looking for signs of continued seditious activity." The implications hit Harry like a sledgehammer. If Umbridge knew about their investigation, if she was reporting their activities to whoever had killed Amelia Bones, then they were in immediate danger. "We need to move the evidence," he said, standing up quickly. "Everything we've gathered, everything we've learned, we need to get it out of the castle before she can seize it." "Move it where?" Hermione asked. Harry looked around the room at the assembled group. His best friends who were struggling to accept the truth, Luna who had provided crucial corroborating evidence, Neville who was fighting his own battle against systematic abuse, and the Hufflepuffs who had risked their safety to warn them about Umbridge's investigation. "Somewhere safe," he said finally. "Somewhere controlled by people who care more about protecting children than protecting their own positions." "And where exactly is that?" Ron asked skeptically. Harry was quiet for a moment, thinking about the list of potential allies that Amelia Bones had compiled, weighing their options against the growing urgency of their situation. "I think," he said slowly, "it's time to find out which adults in this war can actually be trusted with the truth." The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications of what Harry was suggesting. They were no longer just investigating a conspiracy. They were about to actively oppose it, knowing that doing so would make them targets of both sides in the war. But as Harry looked around at the faces of his friends and allies, he saw something that gave him hope. Despite their fear, despite their confusion, despite the overwhelming nature of what they had discovered, they were still here. They were still willing to listen, still willing to help, still willing to fight for the truth. It might not be the immediate, unquestioning support he had hoped for, but it was something. It was the beginning of the army they would need to protect other children from suffering the way they had suffered. And for the first time since this journey began, Harry Potter didn't feel quite so alone. Outside the Room of Requirement, the castle slept peacefully, unaware that a small group of students was planning to tear down the foundations of the wizarding world. But inside the room, 6 young people were discovering that the truth was worth fighting for, even when that fight seemed impossible to win. Even when that fight might cost them everything they had ever believed about the world they were trying to save. Chapter 6. The Professor's Dilemma. 3 days after their confrontation with Hermione and Ron in the Room of Requirement, Harry found himself staring at the ceiling of his dormitory at 2:30 in the morning, sleep as elusive as understanding. The events of the past week had taken on a dreamlike quality, that made him question whether any of it had actually happened. The evidence hidden in his trunk, the allies they had gathered, the growing certainty that their investigation had attracted dangerous attention. All of it felt too large and too terrible to be real. But the brass key Susan had given him was solid weight in his hand, and the memory of Death Eaters hunting them through Hogsmeade was sharp enough to cut. This was real, all of it, and tomorrow they would have to decide how to proceed with the knowledge that Professor Umbridge was actively investigating their activities. Harry slipped out of bed and pulled on his cloak, moving quietly through the dormitory and down into the common room. The fire had burned low, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with purpose rather than chance. Everything about Hogwarts felt different now that he understood how deeply the corruption ran, how many of the people he had trusted were complicit in a system designed to break children into useful pieces. He made his way through the castle corridors, following a path that had become familiar over the past few days. The restricted section of the library held resources they needed for their investigation: ancient texts on magical binding spells, historical records of ministry policies, anything that might help them understand how the conditioning system worked and how it might be dismantled. The library was dark and silent, filled with the peculiar atmosphere that old books and older secrets created. Harry lit his wand with a whispered "Lumos" and began making his way toward the restricted section, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, but still seeming impossibly loud in the silence. He had almost reached the rope barrier that separated the restricted books from the general collection when a voice spoke from the shadows. "Out of bed after hours, Potter. How remarkably predictable." Harry spun around, his wand raised instinctively, and found himself face to face with Professor Snape. The potions master stood between him and the library entrance, dressed in his usual black robes and wearing an expression that was impossible to read in the dim light. "Professor," Harry said, trying to keep his voice steady, "I was just researching magical conditioning techniques and systematic memory modification. If your recent reading habits are any indication," Snape interrupted, stepping closer with the predatory grace that made most students flee his presence. "Tell me, Potter, what exactly has prompted your sudden interest in such specialized and dangerous magical practices?" The question hit too close to home, and Harry felt his heart rate spike with genuine fear. If Snape knew what they were investigating, if he was reporting their activities to Dumbledore or Umbridge, then everything they had worked for was compromised. "I don't know what you mean," Harry said, the lie sitting bitter on his tongue. Snape's lip curled in what might have been amusement or contempt. "Do not insult my intelligence, Potter. Your nocturnal visits to this section of the library have coincided precisely with Miss Bones's investigation into her aunt's death. Your reading selections have focused specifically on texts dealing with long-term psychological manipulation and institutional cover-ups. You have been meeting regularly with a growing circle of students who share an unusual interest in questioning authority figures." Harry's blood ran cold. "You've been watching us. I have been protecting you, you insufferable child, though God knows why I continue to waste my time on such a thankless endeavor." Snape moved closer, and Harry caught the familiar scent of potions ingredients and something else, something that might have been fear. "Do you have any idea how dangerous your little investigation has become? Do you understand that there are people who would kill you to keep their secrets buried?" "People like Dumbledore?" Harry asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. The effect on Snape was immediate and dramatic. The professor went completely still, his black eyes boring into Harry's with an intensity that made him want to step backward. But there was something else in that gaze, something that looked almost like relief. "So you know," Snape said quietly, "or you suspect. Miss Bones has shared her aunt's discoveries with you. You know about Amelia Bones's investigation? I know about many things, Potter. Things that would curdle your blood and break your already fractured faith in the adults who have shaped your life." Snape gestured toward a secluded corner of the library, away from the main aisles. "Come, we have much to discuss, and very little time to discuss it safely. Harry followed, every instinct screaming that this was a trap, while his rational mind pointed out that if Snape wanted to harm him, there were far easier ways to do it than luring him into a conversation. They settled into chairs hidden behind towering bookshelves, the space intimate and oppressive in equal measure. "Let me begin," Snape said, his voice pitched barely above a whisper, "by telling you something that will either destroy your remaining faith in me or provide you with the ally you desperately need. I have been gathering evidence against Albus Dumbledore for the better part of 15 years. The admission hit Harry like a physical blow. "You what?" "I have been documenting his crimes, his manipulations, his systematic destruction of innocent lives in service of his precious, greater good." Snape pulled a small vial from his robes and set it on the table between them. "Memories, Potter. Conversations, decisions, orders given in the belief that I was too broken by guilt and grief to ever act against him." Harry stared at the vial, its silvery contents swirling with captured thoughts and experiences. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because Amelia Bones was not the only person investigating Dumbledore's activities. Because her death has made it clear that he will kill to protect his secrets. And because, God help me, you may be the only person with the power and the motivation to bring him to justice." "The power?" Snape's expression grew bitter. "You are the boy who lived, Potter, the savior of the wizarding world, the symbol of hope against the Dark Lord. Your word carries weight that mine never could. If you were to speak out against Dumbledore, people would listen in a way they would not for a former Death Eater with questionable loyalties." Harry absorbed this, feeling the weight of expectation and manipulation that had shaped his entire life. "And if I refuse? If I decide that the risks are too great? Then more children will suffer as you suffered. More families will be destroyed as yours was destroyed. And Dumbledore will continue to play his games with human lives while positioning himself as the moral authority of our world." Snape leaned forward, his black eyes intense. "But Potter, you need to understand something before you make any decisions. Exposing Dumbledore will not be without consequences for you personally." "What kind of consequences?" Snape was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "The protection spells that have kept you alive since your parents' death are tied directly to Dumbledore's magical signature. They draw their power from his will, his knowledge, his connection to the blood magic your mother created. If he were to be stripped of his magical authority, if he were to be arrested or killed..." "The protection would fail," Harry finished, his throat tight. "More than fail. It would collapse catastrophically, leaving you vulnerable not just to the Dark Lord, but to every enemy you have made over the past 5 years. Every Death Eater who has ever wanted revenge, every dark creature that has been held at bay by your mother's sacrifice, all of them would be free to act against you." Harry felt the familiar weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. "So I can choose between my own safety and the welfare of other children. How thoughtfully manipulative of him." "It is entirely possible that Dumbledore designed the protection spells with exactly this consideration in mind," Snape agreed. "Creating a situation where you would be forced to choose between exposing his crimes and preserving your own life, ensuring that even in his downfall he would have the moral high ground of having protected you when you were unable to protect yourself. But you don't think the protection is absolute?" Snape paused, studying Harry's face in the dim light. "I think there may be ways to transfer or modify the protection that would allow you to survive Dumbledore's downfall. But such magic would be complex, dangerous, and would require resources that we do not currently possess." "What kind of resources?" "Access to your parents' original magical workings, understanding of the specific incantations and blood rituals your mother performed. Most importantly, a magical practitioner powerful enough and trustworthy enough to perform the transfer without killing you in the process. Harry absorbed this information, feeling the familiar sensation of walls closing in around him. Every path forward seemed to lead to impossible choices and unacceptable risks. "Why should I trust you?" he asked finally. "Why should I believe that you're not just another part of Dumbledore's manipulation?" Snape's expression grew thoughtful, almost sad. "Because, Potter, I loved your mother. I have loved her memory every day since her death, and I have lived with the knowledge that my actions contributed to her murder. Dumbledore has used that guilt to control me for 15 years, threatening to expose my role in your parents' death if I ever acted against him. Your role? What role? I was the one who overheard the prophecy, Potter. I was the one who reported it to the Dark Lord, not knowing that it would lead him to your family." Snape's voice grew heavy with self-loathing. "I thought I was providing intelligence about a potential threat to our cause. Instead, I signed your parents' death warrant." The revelation should have filled Harry with rage, but instead he found himself feeling a strange sort of understanding. Dumbledore knew this when he recruited you to spy against Voldemort. He has known it from the beginning. He has used my guilt as a leash, ensuring my loyalty by threatening to reveal my complicity in Lily's death if I ever questioned his methods or his orders. But you questioned them anyway. I began to suspect that something was wrong when I realized how much Dumbledore knew about your home situation and how little he was doing to improve it. Snape pulled another memory vial from his robes. "The first time I attempted to report your obvious signs of abuse, he explained to me that your suffering was necessary for your development as a weapon against the Dark Lord." Harry felt sick. "He told you I was being abused and asked you to ignore it. He told me that your conditioning was proceeding according to plan, and that any interference would compromise the effectiveness of the process." Snape's voice was flat, emotionless. "He showed me psychological profiles, detailing how your experiences of abandonment and abuse would make you more effective as a soldier. And you said nothing. I said nothing because I was a coward, because I was more afraid of losing Dumbledore's protection than I was concerned about one child's welfare." Snape met Harry's eyes directly. "I have regretted that choice every day since, Potter. It is why I have been gathering evidence against him. It is why I am risking everything to speak with you now." Harry stared at the professor who had tormented him for 5 years, seeing him in a completely different light. Snape was not just a cruel teacher or a reformed Death Eater. He was another victim of Dumbledore's manipulation, controlled through guilt and fear, just as Harry had been controlled through isolation and gratitude. "What evidence do you have?" Harry asked. Snape gestured to the memory vials. "Conversations in which Dumbledore discussed your conditioning with clinical detachment, orders to ignore reports of child abuse, instructions to other Order members about how to manipulate your emotional responses to ensure your compliance. Orders to other Order members. Your precious Molly Weasley was specifically instructed to provide you with just enough maternal affection to make you grateful, but not enough to make you feel truly secure. Arthur Weasley was told to position himself as a father figure while maintaining enough distance to ensure you never felt completely accepted." Harry felt something break inside his chest. The Weasleys who had welcomed him into their home, who had made him feel like part of their family. Even that had been orchestrated, calculated, designed to serve Dumbledore's purposes. How many people knew? Fewer than you might expect, more than you would hope. Most of the Order members followed orders without understanding the larger picture. Only Dumbledore's inner circle was aware of the full scope of the conditioning program. And you were part of that inner circle. I was a useful tool, just as you are, just as all of us have been. Snape leaned back in his chair, looking older and more tired than Harry had ever seen him. The difference is that I finally understood what was being done to us and chose to act against it. Even knowing it might expose your role in my parents' death. Your parents are dead, Potter. Nothing I do now can change that. But you are alive, and there are other children who might yet be saved if we can stop this system from continuing." Harry was quiet for a long moment, processing everything Snape had told him. The professor's confession had answered many questions while raising others, but it had also presented him with the impossible choice he had been dreading. "If we expose Dumbledore," Harry said slowly, "if we reveal the truth about the conditioning program and his role in orchestrating child abuse, what happens to the war against Voldemort? The war becomes infinitely more complex. The wizarding world loses faith in their primary leader against the Dark Lord. Chaos ensues, and in that chaos, many people die who might otherwise have lived. And if we do nothing, more children suffer in silence. The conditioning program continues to produce broken soldiers for Dumbledore's army. And you live with the knowledge that you chose your own safety over justice for countless victims." The weight of the decision pressed down on Harry like a physical burden. Every choice led to suffering. Every path forward required sacrificing someone's welfare for someone else's benefit. It was, he realized, exactly the kind of impossible decision that Dumbledore had been training him to make his entire life. "There's a third option," Harry said suddenly, the idea crystallizing as he spoke. "We don't expose Dumbledore publicly. We use the evidence to force him to dismantle the conditioning program voluntarily." Snape raised an eyebrow. "Blackmail. Negotiation. We approach him with the evidence and give him a choice. End the systematic abuse of children, or face public exposure and criminal prosecution. And what makes you think he would agree to such terms?" Harry thought about everything he had learned about Dumbledore's methods and motivations. Because his entire sense of self is built on being seen as the moral authority of the wizarding world. The threat of public exposure as a child abuser would be more terrifying to him than death. You may be right. But Potter, you need to understand that such an approach would still be extraordinarily dangerous. Dumbledore does not react well to threats, and he has resources at his disposal that we can only guess at. More dangerous than letting the conditioning program continue? More dangerous than allowing other children to suffer the way I suffered? Snape was quiet for a moment, studying Harry's face in the dim light. "You have grown up, Potter. The broken child who arrived at Hogwarts 5 years ago would never have considered such a complex approach to an impossible problem. The broken child you're talking about was exactly what Dumbledore wanted me to remain," Harry replied. "Grateful, compliant, willing to sacrifice myself without question. But that child is gone, Professor, and I'm not sure what I'm becoming in his place." "You are becoming someone who might actually be capable of winning this war," Snape said quietly. "Not through military victory, but through moral clarity. Not by destroying enemies, but by refusing to become one." Harry felt something shift inside him at the professor's words, a sense of possibility that had been missing from his life for as long as he could remember. For the first time since learning the truth about his conditioning, he felt like he might be able to choose his own path rather than simply reacting to the choices others had made for him. "Will you help us?" he asked. "If Susan and I decide to approach Dumbledore directly, will you provide the evidence we need to force his hand?" "I will do more than that," Snape said, pulling out a small, leather-bound journal. "I will help you understand how to survive the confrontation." "What do you mean?" "I mean that approaching Dumbledore with threats requires preparation, Potter. You need to understand his methods, his weaknesses, his likely responses to pressure. You need to know which arguments will be effective and which will simply make him more dangerous." Snape opened the journal and revealed pages of careful notes, psychological profiles, and strategic assessments. 15 years of observing Albus Dumbledore have taught me many things about how his mind works. He is brilliant, ruthless, and utterly convinced of his own moral authority. But he is also vain, controlling, and terrified of being seen as fallible. You've been planning this confrontation for years. I have been preparing for the possibility that someone with the power and credibility to challenge him might eventually emerge. I never imagined it would be you, Potter, but perhaps it is fitting. The weapon he created may be the only thing capable of dismantling the system that created it. Harry took the journal with steady hands, feeling the weight of knowledge and strategy that might finally give them a chance against someone as powerful and manipulative as Dumbledore. But even as hope flickered to life in his chest, he was aware that they were committing themselves to a path that would change everything about their lives and their world. "There's something else you need to know," Snape said, his voice growing even quieter. Miss Bones's investigation was not discovered by accident. Someone close to her, someone she trusted, revealed her activities to the people who had her killed. The double agent we suspected, more than suspected, confirmed. And Potter, this person is not just feeding information to Death Eaters. They are reporting directly to Dumbledore while maintaining their position within both the Order and the Ministry. Harry felt ice water run through his veins. Who? I don't know for certain, but I have suspicions, and those suspicions center on someone who has been positioned to monitor your activities since your first year at Hogwarts. Professor McGonagall? Snape shook his head. Someone closer. Someone who has access to your daily routine, your emotional state, your relationships with other students. The implication hit Harry like a physical blow. You think it's someone at Hogwarts, someone who's been watching me for Dumbledore this entire time. I think it's someone who has been reporting on your development as a weapon, ensuring that your conditioning proceeds according to plan, and eliminating threats to that conditioning when they arise. Harry thought about all the teachers, students, and staff members who had been part of his life at Hogwarts, trying to imagine which of them might be capable of betraying Amelia Bones to her death. The possibilities were terrifying, not because they were unlikely, but because they were all too plausible. How do we identify them? Carefully, quietly, and with the understanding that making a mistake could get us all killed. Snape stood and gathered his memory vials. But Potter, first we need to ensure that you and Miss Bones survive long enough to confront Dumbledore. Your investigation has attracted attention from multiple dangerous parties, and I fear that time is running out. What do you mean? I mean that the people who killed Amelia Bones are not content to simply monitor your activities. They are preparing to act against you directly, and when they do, it will not be a warning or a threat. It will be an elimination. Harry felt the familiar chill of approaching danger. How long do we have? Days, perhaps less. Which means that if you intend to force Dumbledore's hand, you need to do it immediately. Before he has us killed to protect his secrets. Or before the war escalates to the point where exposing him becomes impossible without handing victory to the Dark Lord. Snape moved toward the library entrance, then paused. Potter, I want you to understand something. What we are planning, approaching Dumbledore directly, threatening to expose his crimes, demanding that he dismantle a system he has spent decades creating. It may succeed in protecting future children, but it will not undo what was done to you. I know that. Do you? Because the child in you, the broken, grateful weapon that Dumbledore created, will always exist. The conditioning you received cannot be simply erased or forgotten. Even if we succeed in our goals, you will spend the rest of your life fighting against the psychological programming that shaped your early development. Harry considered this, feeling the truth of it in his bones. Then I suppose I'll have to learn to be stronger than my programming. Yes, Snape said quietly. You will. And Potter? For what it's worth, I believe you can be. After the professor disappeared into the shadows of the corridor, Harry sat alone among the ancient books, holding Snape's journal and feeling the weight of decisions that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of every child who came after him. Tomorrow, he would meet with Susan and their growing circle of allies. Tomorrow, they would plan their approach to Dumbledore, knowing that failure would likely mean death for all of them. But tonight, for the first time since this journey began, Harry Potter felt like he understood the true scope of what they were fighting against and what they were fighting for. They were not just seeking justice for past crimes. They were trying to break a cycle of abuse and manipulation that had shaped an entire generation of magical children. They were trying to ensure that no other child would have to grow up as a weapon in someone else's war. The brass key Susan had given him felt warm in his pocket, a reminder of the evidence that could change everything if they were brave enough and clever enough to use it properly. But more than that, it felt like a symbol of choice, the choice to reject the role that had been forced on him, the choice to fight for something better, the choice to risk everything for the possibility that future children might be allowed to grow up whole and free. Outside the library windows, dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the sky, painting the world in shades of possibility and hope. Harry Potter gathered his resolve and prepared to face whatever came next, knowing that the child he had been was gone forever, but that the person he was becoming might finally be strong enough to win the war that had been raging around him his entire life. The war for the soul of the wizarding world, the war for the right of children to be children rather than weapons, the war for a future worth fighting for. Chapter 7. The Minister's Gambit. The summons arrived during breakfast on a grey Tuesday morning, delivered by a pristine ministry owl that landed directly in front of Susan with the kind of precision that suggested official business. The parchment bore the seal of the Minister for Magic himself, and every student within a 10-foot radius stopped eating to stare as Susan broke the wax and read the formal script within. Harry watched her face change as she processed the contents of the letter, her expression shifting from confusion to alarm to something that looked very much like disgust. Around them, the Great Hall continued its normal morning routine. Students complained about upcoming exams. House tables buzzed with gossip about the latest Quidditch scandal. Teachers moved between the tables with their usual mixture of authority and exhaustion. But Harry felt as if he and Susan were suddenly existing in a different reality, one where formal ministry communications arrived to disrupt their carefully laid plans. "What is it?" Harry asked quietly, leaning closer to Susan's shoulder so he could read the letter without attracting additional attention from their curious housemates. "An invitation," Susan said, her voice carefully controlled. "Minister Fudge requests my presence at the ministry this afternoon to discuss matters of mutual interest relating to my aunt's estate." "Your aunt's estate?" Harry repeated, understanding immediately why Susan looked so unsettled. "He knows. Worse than that. He knows, and he's not trying to hide the fact that he knows." Susan folded the letter and slipped it into her robes, but not before Harry caught sight of additional text written in what appeared to be a different hand. "There's more. A postscript that suggests he has information about my aunt's death that he believes I'll find illuminating." Harry felt the familiar chill of approaching danger. Over the past week, since their conversation with Professor Snape, they had been moving carefully and quietly, gathering additional allies and preparing for their planned confrontation with Dumbledore. But this development suggested that events were accelerating beyond their control, that the political forces they had been trying to navigate were about to trap them in a game they weren't prepared to play. "We need to talk to the others," Harry said, glancing toward the Ravenclaw table where Luna sat reading the Quibbler while methodically eating her porridge. At the Hufflepuff table, Ernie and Hannah were engaged in what appeared to be an intense discussion about their defense against the dark arts homework. But Harry knew they were actually reviewing the security protocols they had established for protecting their evidence. "After classes," Susan agreed. "But Harry, I think we need to consider the possibility that Minister Fudge isn't the only one who knows about our investigation. This letter, It reads like someone who has been watching us for weeks. Someone who understands exactly what we've been doing and why. The implications of that observation followed Harry through his morning classes like a persistent shadow. During charms, he found himself studying Professor Flitwick's face for signs of hidden knowledge or ulterior motives. During transfiguration, he watched Professor McGonagall with new suspicion, remembering Snape's warning about a double agent close to Dumbledore. By the time they reached Defense Against the Dark Arts, Harry was so paranoid that he jumped when Professor Umbridge called on him to demonstrate a basic shield charm. "Mr. Potter," Umbridge said in her sickly sweet voice, "you seem distracted today. Perhaps you could share with the class what has captured your attention so thoroughly that you cannot focus on your magical education." The question felt like a trap, weighted with implications that went far beyond classroom management. Harry looked at Umbridge's toad-like face and saw something in her eyes that confirmed his worst suspicions. She knew about their investigation, about the evidence they had gathered, about the plans they were making. "Nothing important, Professor," Harry said carefully. "Just thinking about homework assignments." "Homework assignments," Umbridge repeated, her voice dripping with false concern. "How wonderfully conscientious of you, Mr. Potter. I do hope you're not overwhelming yourself with extracurricular research projects. Sometimes, students can become so focused on investigating matters that don't concern them that they neglect their actual studies." The emphasis she placed on the word investigating made Harry's blood run cold. There was no mistaking her meaning. She was telling him, in front of the entire class, that she was aware of what he and Susan had been doing and that she considered it inappropriate student behavior. "I'll keep that in mind, Professor," Harry replied, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I'm sure you will," Umbridge said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Class dismissed. Oh, and Mr. Potter, do try to make good choices about how you spend your free time. Poor choices have a way of leading to unfortunate consequences." Harry left the classroom feeling like he had just been threatened, though the words themselves had been carefully chosen to sound like routine teacher advice. Susan fell into step beside him as they walked toward their usual meeting place in the room of requirement, her expression grim. "She knows," Susan said without preamble. "Umbridge knows about everything we've been doing, and she's not even trying to hide it anymore." "Which means Fudge probably knows too," Harry agreed. "Which means his invitation to you this afternoon isn't about your aunt's estate. It's about using our evidence for his own political purposes." They found Luna, Neville, and the Hufflepuffs already waiting in the room of requirement, which had configured itself as a secure meeting space with privacy wards and comfortable seating arranged in a circle. The atmosphere was tense, with the kind of nervous energy that came from knowing that their investigation had attracted dangerous attention. "Fudge wants to meet with me this afternoon," Susan announced without preamble as she took her seat. "Officially, it's about my aunt's estate. Unofficially, I think he wants to make a deal for the evidence we've gathered." "What kind of deal?" Ernie asked, his usually cheerful demeanor replaced by serious concern. "The kind where he uses our evidence to destroy Dumbledore's reputation and save his own political career," Harry said grimly. "Fudge has spent months being made to look like an incompetent fool for refusing to acknowledge Voldemort's return. If he can prove that Dumbledore has been systematically abusing children, he can reframe his resistance to Dumbledore's influence as protective instinct rather than political stubbornness." Luna looked up from the journal she had been reading, her pale eyes unusually focused. "Father says the ministry is in chaos. Half the department heads are refusing to follow Fudge's orders, and there are rumors that several prominent families are calling for his resignation. If he's approaching you directly, Susan, it means he's desperate." "Desperate people make dangerous choices," Neville observed quietly. "My grandmother always said that a cornered politician will sacrifice anyone and anything to save their own position." Hannah Abbott leaned forward in her chair. "But if Fudge exposes the evidence publicly, won't that accomplish what we've been trying to do? Won't it bring justice for Harry and all the other children who were abused? Justice administered by Cornelius Fudge isn't justice at all, Susan replied with bitter certainty. It's political theatre designed to distract from his own failures. If we let him control the narrative, the focus will be on his heroic efforts to expose corruption rather than on the actual victims of that corruption. Plus, Harry added, giving the evidence to Fudge means losing any control over how it's used. He could edit it, suppress parts of it that implicate his own administration, or use it selectively to target his political enemies while protecting his allies. So we refuse to meet with him, Justin suggested. We ignore the summons and continue with our original plan. It's not that simple, Susan said, pulling out the letter from Fudge and reading from the postscript. He says here that he has information about my aunt's murder that he's willing to share if I cooperate with his investigation. Information that could identify her killer. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. If Fudge genuinely knew who had murdered Amelia Bones, that information could be crucial for their own safety and for bringing her killer to justice. But if he was lying, if this was simply a manipulation designed to get them to cooperate, then meeting with him could walk them directly into a trap. What do you think, Harry? Luna asked, her ethereal voice cutting through the tension. What does your instinct tell you about Minister Fudge's offer? Harry was quiet for a moment, thinking about everything they had learned about the political forces swirling around their investigation. I think Fudge is telling the truth about having information about Amelia's murder. But I also think he's planning to use that information as leverage to force our cooperation rather than as a genuine effort to seek justice. So we attend the meeting, Neville said slowly. But we go in prepared for manipulation and betrayal. We attend the meeting, Susan agreed, but not alone, and not without insurance. She pulled out a small mirror from her bag, one half of a pair of communication mirrors that Harry recognized as similar to the one Sirius had given him years earlier. Ernie has the other mirror. If the meeting goes badly, if Fudge tries to trap me or coerce me into giving him the evidence, you'll know immediately. And then what? Hannah asked. Then we implement the emergency protocol we discussed with Professor Snape, Harry said grimly. We approach Dumbledore directly with our demands, before Fudge can steal our leverage or twist our evidence for his own purposes. The plan was risky, but it was the best they could manage given the rapidly deteriorating situation. Susan would attend the meeting with Fudge while the others monitored from a distance, ready to act if she needed help or if the situation turned dangerous. If Fudge attempted to coerce her cooperation or steal their evidence, they would accelerate their timeline and force a confrontation with Dumbledore immediately. What none of them expected was that Dumbledore would force the confrontation himself. Susan had been gone for barely an hour when the Room of Requirement's door burst open and Professor Dumbledore strode in, his usually serene expression replaced by something that looked very much like controlled fury. Behind him came Professor McGonagall, her face pale with what might have been shock or fear, and Professor Snape, whose black eyes immediately found Harry's and conveyed a warning that made his blood run cold. Mr. Potter, Dumbledore said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that had made him one of the most powerful wizards in the world, I believe we need to have a conversation. Harry stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving toward his wand while his mind raced through possible responses. Around him, Luna, Neville, and the Hufflepuffs remained seated, but alert, clearly understanding that this was the confrontation they had been preparing for, but hoping to control the timing of. Professor, Harry said carefully, if this is about my meeting with Professor Snape last night, this is about far more than a single conversation, Dumbledore interrupted, moving deeper into the room with the measured pace of someone who was absolutely certain of his moral authority. This is about a campaign of lies and accusations that threatens to undermine everything we have worked to build together. Everything you have worked to build, Harry corrected, feeling his anger begin to override his caution. "I was never consulted about your plans, Professor. I was simply shaped to fit them." "You have been manipulated," Dumbledore said, his blue eyes boring into Harry's with an intensity that felt like a physical presence. "Someone has filled your mind with distorted versions of events, with carefully constructed lies designed to turn you against the people who have sacrificed everything to protect you." "Sacrificed everything?" Harry's voice rose with genuine incredulity. "Professor, I have documented evidence of your knowledge of my abuse. I have correspondence proving that you deliberately left me with people who starved and beat me because you thought my suffering would make me more useful as a weapon. You have documents that have been edited and altered to create a false narrative," Dumbledore replied calmly. "Someone has taken legitimate correspondence and twisted it to support accusations that have no basis in reality." The casual dismissal of Harry's evidence, the implication that his experiences of abuse were simply misunderstood or fabricated, hit him like a physical blow. But before he could respond, Luna Lovegood spoke up from her corner of the room. "Professor Dumbledore," she said in her dreamy voice, "are you suggesting that Harry Potter's memories of his childhood are inaccurate? Are you claiming that the physical evidence of his abuse, the medical records, the social services reports, the witness testimony, has all been fabricated?" Dumbledore turned his attention to Luna with the kind of patient expression he might use with a confused child. "Miss Lovegood, you are young and trusting, and you have been exposed to a very sophisticated campaign of misinformation. The documents you have seen may appear authentic, but appearances can be deceiving when dealing with people who have powerful motivations to destroy our cause." "Our cause?" Neville stood up, his round face flushed with anger that Harry had never seen from his typically mild-mannered friend. "Professor, what cause justifies leaving a child with abusive relatives? What greater good requires the systematic torture of innocent children?" "Mr. Longbottom," Professor McGonagall said quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the room, "you don't understand the complexities of the situation. The decisions that were made about Harry's placement were never taken lightly, and they were always made with his ultimate welfare in mind." "His ultimate welfare?" Harry laughed bitterly. "Professor McGonagall, you were there the night I was left with the Dursleys. You saw what they were like. You expressed concerns about their character. And you were overruled because my immediate welfare was considered less important than some theoretical future benefit." McGonagall's face went very pale. "Harry, that's not. The situation was more complex than you understand." "Then explain it to me," Harry challenged. "Explain how leaving a child with people who locked him in a cupboard and fed him barely enough to survive was in his best interests." "The blood protection," Dumbledore began, "required me to live with my aunt," Harry interrupted, "not to be abused by her family. There's a difference, Professor, and you know it." For the first time since entering the room, Dumbledore looked genuinely uncertain. "Harry, the protection spells were more complex than you realize. They required specific conditions to remain effective, conditions that sometimes necessitated difficult choices about your daily care. Difficult choices like ignoring reports from teachers who noticed my bruises. Difficult choices like memory-modifying social workers who tried to investigate my living conditions. Difficult choices like threatening order members who suggested that maybe, just maybe, a child shouldn't have to live in fear and hunger." Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment, and Harry saw something shift in his expression, a crack in the facade of benevolent authority that he had maintained for so long. "The war against Voldemort requires sacrifices from all of us," Dumbledore said finally, his voice lacking its usual warmth. "Some of those sacrifices are more visible than others, but they are all necessary for the greater good." "The greater good," Harry repeated, feeling something crystallize in his mind. "That's always your answer, isn't it, Professor? When confronted with evidence of your crimes, you invoke the greater good. When challenged about the children you've destroyed, you talk about necessary sacrifices. When forced to acknowledge the suffering you've caused, you claim it was all for some noble purpose that justifies any cruelty. You are too young to understand, Dumbledore began. I'm old enough to understand that you've been using me my entire life. Harry cut him off, his voice gaining strength with each word. I'm old enough to understand that every kindness you've shown me was calculated to ensure my gratitude and compliance. I'm old enough to understand that you orchestrated my parents' deaths to create the perfect weapon against Voldemort. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Professor McGonagall gasped audibly, and even Professor Snape looked shocked by the directness of Harry's words. But Dumbledore's expression didn't change, and his silence was more damning than any denial could have been. You don't deny it, Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. You're not even going to try to deny it. I will not justify my actions to a child who has been manipulated into believing lies about people who love him, Dumbledore said. But his voice lacked conviction. Then justify them to me. The voice came from the doorway, and everyone turned to see Susan Bones entering the room with the communication mirror in her hand. Her face was flushed with anger and determination, and there was something in her posture that spoke of someone who had just learned truths that confirmed her worst fears. Miss Bones, Dumbledore said, his tone becoming warmer and more grandfatherly. I understand you've had a difficult conversation with the minister. Please don't let his political desperation colour your judgment about matters you don't fully understand. Oh, I understand perfectly, Susan replied, moving to stand beside Harry with the kind of solidarity that made his chest tight with gratitude. Minister Fudge was very enlightening about the scope of your crimes, Professor. He has evidence that you've been systematically abusing children for decades. Evidence that you've been using guilt and trauma to control your allies. Evidence that you've been playing all sides in this war to ensure that you remain the moral authority, regardless of who wins. Cornelius Fudge is a desperate man clinging to power, Dumbledore said dismissively. He would say anything to— He showed me photographs, Susan interrupted, her voice cutting through Dumbledore's excuses like a blade. Photographs of Harry, taken during his first medical examination at Hogwarts. Photographs that document years of systematic abuse. Photographs that you received copies of and chose to ignore. The room fell into complete silence. Harry felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, but some fundamental faith in the idea that the adults in his life had ever cared about his welfare. You saw proof of what they had done to me, he said quietly. And you did nothing. Harry, McGonagall began, her voice thick with what sounded like genuine anguish. Did you see the photographs too, Professor? Harry asked, turning to face his head of house. Did you know what the Dursleys were doing to me? McGonagall's face crumpled, and she sank into one of the chairs, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. We thought— Albus assured us that it was necessary, that the protection spells required specific conditions that we couldn't interfere with. You knew, Harry said, his voice growing stronger with anger. All of you knew, and you chose to let it continue because it served Dumbledore's purposes. We saved your life, Dumbledore said, but his voice lacked its usual authority. Whatever suffering you endured, it was a small price to pay for ensuring that you survived to fulfill your destiny. My destiny? Harry laughed, the sound harsh and bitter. You mean my conditioning, my programming to be the perfect martyr for your cause? You are the boy who lived, Dumbledore said, his blue eyes blazing with something that might have been desperation. You are the symbol of hope against the darkness, the proof that love can triumph over hate. That role comes with responsibilities that require sacrifice. Whose responsibilities? Susan demanded, stepping closer to Dumbledore with the fearlessness of someone who had nothing left to lose. Harry's responsibilities, or yours? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been asking children to make all the sacrifices while you position yourself as the wise leader who guides them to their noble deaths. Miss Bones, you are overwrought. I am angry, Susan corrected. I am angry that you killed my aunt when she tried to expose your crimes. I am angry that you've been destroying children for decades while pretending to be their protector. And I am angry that you're still standing here, acting like you have any moral authority to lecture anyone about anything. For the first time since entering the room, Dumbledore looked genuinely shaken. Your aunt's death was a tragedy, but it was not my doing. Wasn't it? Susan pulled out a piece of parchment from her robes. This is a copy of the last communication my aunt received before her death. A message telling her to come alone to a meeting about Harry's welfare. A message that came from someone she trusted enough to ignore her own safety protocols. She handed the parchment to Harry, who read it with growing horror. The message was brief and written in careful script that disguised the sender's identity, but the content was chilling in its implications. A. Bones. Urgent meeting required regarding Potter Boy's welfare. New evidence of ongoing abuse requires immediate action. Come alone. Security breach suspected in DMLE. Trust no one, except me, a friend. She went to this meeting, Susan continued, her voice steady, despite the tears running down her face. She went because someone she trusted told her that Harry was in immediate danger. And she died because you couldn't allow her to expose what you'd been doing to children. I didn't kill Amelia Bones, Dumbledore said, but his voice sounded hollow. Maybe you didn't cast the spell personally, Harry said, understanding flooding through him. But you ordered it. You decided that her investigation posed too great a threat to your plans, and you arranged for her elimination. Harry, you're making accusations based on grief and manipulation. I'm making accusations based on evidence, Harry cut him off. Evidence that Minister Fudge was happy to share in exchange for my cooperation in destroying your reputation. Dumbledore's face went very pale. You gave Fudge the evidence? I didn't need to, Susan said with grim satisfaction. He already had his own copies. Apparently, someone in your inner circle has been keeping detailed records of your crimes as insurance against exactly this kind of exposure. The implication that one of Dumbledore's most trusted allies had been gathering evidence against him seemed to hit the headmaster like a physical blow. He aged 10 years in the space of a few seconds, his shoulders sagging as the weight of his exposed crimes settled on him. Who? He asked quietly. Does it matter? Harry asked. The point is that your system of manipulation and control was built on the loyalty of people you were secretly betraying. The point is that even your closest allies couldn't stomach what you were doing to children. The point is that your entire moral authority was built on lies, and those lies are finally being exposed. Dumbledore stood in silence for a long moment, seeming to weigh his options. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of grandfatherly warmth. What do you want? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Harry looked around the room at his friends and allies, all of whom were watching him with expressions of support and determination. Susan stood beside him, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. Even Professor Snape, lurking in the shadows near the door, gave him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. We want the conditioning program ended, Harry said clearly. We want all the children who have been placed in abusive situations removed and placed with proper magical guardians. We want an independent investigation into the scope of your crimes and the crimes of everyone who enabled them. And we want your resignation from every position of authority you hold. And if I refuse? Then the evidence becomes public, Susan said without hesitation. Every document, every photograph, every piece of correspondence proving your systematic abuse of children gets released to the Daily Prophet, the Quibbler, and every major news outlet in the wizarding world. Your reputation as the great Albus Dumbledore dies, and you spend whatever time you have left in Azkaban for child abuse and murder. Dumbledore considered this for a long moment, his blue eyes moving between Harry and Susan as if he were seeing them for the first time. "You would risk the war against Voldemort for the sake of revenge?" "We would end the war against children for the sake of justice," Harry corrected. "And if that means the wizarding world has to find a new leader to fight Voldemort, maybe that's exactly what needs to happen. You don't understand the consequences of what you're demanding." "We understand that children are more important than politics," Susan said fiercely. "We understand that protecting innocent victims is more important than protecting your reputation. And we understand that the wizarding world deserves better than a leader who views child abuse as an acceptable cost of doing business." For the first time in his life, Harry saw Albus Dumbledore completely defeated. The great wizard who had shaped Harry's entire world, who had orchestrated events from behind the scenes for decades, who had maintained absolute moral authority through sheer force of reputation, that man was gone, replaced by someone who looked old and tired and broken. "You will destroy everything I have worked to build," Dumbledore said quietly. "Good," Harry replied without hesitation. "It deserves to be destroyed." Outside the room of requirement, the castle continued its normal afternoon routine, unaware that the foundations of the wizarding world's power structure were crumbling. But inside the room, a small group of students had just forced the most powerful wizard in Britain to confront the true cost of his lifelong pursuit of the greater good. And for the first time since this journey began, Harry Potter felt like he might actually be winning the war that mattered most, the war for the right of children to be protected rather than used, to be loved rather than manipulated, to grow up whole and free rather than broken and grateful. The brass key Susan had given him so many weeks ago still felt warm in his pocket, but now it felt less like a burden and more like a symbol of victory. They had done it. They had confronted the most powerful man in their world and forced him to face the consequences of his crimes. The question now was whether he would choose justice or destruction, whether he would accept their demands and dismantle the system he had built, or whether he would force them to destroy him publicly and risk everything they had worked to protect. But as Harry looked at the defeated figure of Albus Dumbledore, he realized that for the first time in his life, he didn't care which choice the headmaster made. Either way, the truth was finally out. Either way, the children would be protected. Either way, Harry Potter was no longer anyone's weapon. He was finally, truly free. Chapter 8. The Battle for Truth. The morning after their confrontation with Dumbledore, Harry woke to find the entire wizarding world had exploded. He knew something was wrong before he even opened his eyes. The dormitory was filled with an unusual buzz of activity, hushed, urgent conversations that stopped abruptly whenever footsteps approached. Through the windows, he could hear the distinctive sound of dozens of owls arriving at once, their wings creating a thunderous rustling that spoke of major news breaking across the magical community. Harry sat up in his bed and found Ron and the other Gryffindor boys staring at him, with expressions that ranged from shock to accusation to something that might have been fear. Dean Thomas was holding a copy of the Daily Prophet, his dark face pale with disbelief, while Seamus Finnegan clutched a letter that appeared to be smoking slightly around the edges. "Harry," Ron said carefully, his voice carrying the tone of someone trying not to provoke a dangerous animal, "please tell me you didn't do what this says you did." Harry's stomach dropped. "What does it say I did?" Ron held up his own copy of the Daily Prophet, and Harry saw his own photograph on the front page beneath a headline that made his blood run cold. "Boy who lived accuses Dumbledore of systematic child abuse. Ministry investigation reveals decades of cover-ups. Exclusive evidence provided by Harry Potter and Susan Bones *. The photograph showed Harry and Susan standing together outside the Ministry of Magic, clearly taken yesterday during Susan's meeting with Fudge. But what made Harry's chest tighten with dread was the expression on his photographed face. Determined, angry, uncompromising. This wasn't the grateful, heroic boy who lived that the wizarding world expected to see. This was someone who looked like he was declaring war. Oh no. Harry breathed, taking the newspaper with shaking hands. "Susan and I never agreed to. We didn't authorize." "So it's true?" Dean asked, his voice cracking slightly. "The stuff they're saying about Professor Dumbledore, about what happened to you as a kid. It's all true?" Harry scanned the article quickly, his horror growing with each paragraph. Someone had leaked not just the evidence they had gathered, but private details from their investigation that should never have become public. The article contained quotes that appeared to be from Susan and himself, though Harry was certain neither of them had spoken to any reporters. More damning, it included excerpts from the most devastating pieces of evidence: Dumbledore's correspondence about Harry's conditioning, medical records documenting his abuse, testimony from witnesses who had tried to report his mistreatment. "This isn't how we wanted this to happen," Harry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We were trying to force Dumbledore to reform the system quietly. We never intended for it to become a public spectacle." "But it is true," Seamus said, and there was an edge to his voice that Harry had never heard before. "You really are accusing the greatest wizard of our time of abusing children." "I'm not accusing him," Harry replied, looking up from the newspaper to meet Seamus's eyes directly. "I'm stating facts. Facts that are documented, witnessed, and undeniable." "Facts according to who?" Ron demanded, his face flushing red with anger. "Harry, do you have any idea what you've done? Do you understand that you've just destroyed the reputation of the only person standing between us and you-know-who?" "I've exposed the truth about someone who has been systematically abusing children for decades," Harry shot back, his own anger flaring. "And if that inconveniences the war effort, maybe we need to find better leaders than child abusers." "Better leaders?" Ron's voice rose to nearly a shout. "Harry, Dumbledore is the reason you're alive. He's the reason any of us are alive. And you're destroying him based on... what? Some documents that could have been forged? Some memories that could have been altered?" "Based on my own experiences," Harry said, standing up and facing his best friend directly. "Based on years of abuse that I lived through, that left scars on my body and my mind that no amount of denial can erase. Based on evidence that multiple independent sources have confirmed." "Your experiences were..." Ron began, then stopped himself, clearly realizing that he was about to say something unforgivable. "Were what, Ron?" Harry asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Were not that bad? Were misunderstood? Were justified because they served some greater purpose?" Ron's face went very pale. "That's not what I meant." "Isn't it? Because that's exactly what Dumbledore said when we confronted him yesterday, that my suffering was necessary, that it served the greater good, that I was too young and damaged to understand the complexities of the situation." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of broken friendships and shattered trust. Harry could see the exact moment when Ron made his choice, when he decided that preserving his faith in Dumbledore was more important than supporting his best friend's claims of abuse. "I think you should talk to someone," Ron said finally, his voice carefully controlled. "I think this whole thing has affected your judgment more than you realize. Maybe Madame Pomfrey could help, or maybe you could believe your best friend when he tells you he was systematically tortured as a child," Harry interrupted. "Maybe you could trust that I'm capable of understanding my own experiences." "Harry," Dean said uncomfortably, "Ron's not saying you're lying. He's just saying that maybe there's more to this than you understand. Maybe Professor Dumbledore had reasons for his decisions that we can't see." The careful, diplomatic tone in Dean's voice told Harry everything he needed to know about how this conversation was going to end. His friends, the people who had stood by him through everything, were choosing to believe that his claims of abuse were either false or justified, rather than accept that their hero had committed crimes against children. Harry gathered his things without another word and left the dormitory, the weight of isolation settling on his shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome cloak. But as he made his way down to the common room, he realized that his personal pain was the least of his concerns. If the wizarding world was reacting to the evidence the way his roommates were reacting, with denial, rationalization, and anger at the accusers rather than the accused, then they had unleashed something far more dangerous than a simple political scandal. The Gryffindor common room confirmed his worst fears. Students were gathered in tight clusters, their voices low but intense as they discussed the morning's revelations. Many of them looked up as Harry entered, their expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion to outright hostility. Near the fireplace, a group of younger students huddled around Ginny Weasley, who appeared to be reading aloud from what looked like a letter from her parents. "Mother says it's obvious that Harry has been manipulated by dark forces," Ginny was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "She thinks someone has been using Imperius curses or false memories to make him believe these horrible things about Professor Dumbledore." "That makes sense," said Colin Creevey, nodding eagerly. "Harry would never turn against Professor Dumbledore unless someone was controlling his mind." Harry felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart, but something deeper. Some fundamental faith in the idea that people would choose truth over comfortable lies. These students, people he had fought alongside, people he had risked his life to protect, were finding it easier to believe that he was under dark magic influence than to accept that their beloved headmaster was capable of systematic child abuse. "Actually," said a familiar, dreamy voice from the corner, "it makes more sense that people would refuse to believe documented evidence of child abuse, because accepting it would require them to question everything they think they know about moral authority." Luna Lovegood stood near the portrait hole, her pale eyes taking in the scene with unusual sharpness. She wasn't a Gryffindor, which meant she had no business being in their common room, but no one seemed inclined to challenge her right to be there. "Luna," Harry said, relief flooding through him at seeing a friendly face. "Hello, Harry," she said, moving to stand beside him, with the casual fearlessness that made her such an invaluable ally. "I thought you should know that the response in the other houses has been quite similar to this. Lots of people insisting that you must be confused or controlled, very few people willing to examine the actual evidence." "Of course they are," Harry said bitterly. "It's easier to assume I'm lying or delusional than to accept that they've been supporting a child abuser." "Harry Potter is not lying," Susan Bones said firmly, entering the common room through the portrait hole with an expression of grim determination on her face. Like Luna, she had no official right to be in the Gryffindor common room, but also like Luna, she seemed entirely unconcerned by that technicality. The room fell completely silent as Susan approached Harry and Luna, her presence adding a new tension to an already fraught situation. Harry could see students whispering to each other, pointing at Susan with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion. "Miss Bones," Ginny said, standing up from her place by the fireplace, "maybe you could explain to everyone how this information ended up in the Daily Prophet when you and Harry supposedly wanted to handle things quietly." There was an accusation in Ginny's voice that made Harry's anger flare, but Susan answered with the kind of calm dignity that he was beginning to associate with her public persona. "Someone leaked information from our investigation without our knowledge or consent," Susan said clearly, her voice carrying throughout the common room. "We believe it was done deliberately to force a public confrontation before we were ready to control the narrative." "How convenient," said someone from the back of the room. "Harry thought it might be Lavender Brown. Blame someone else when your accusations get out of hand." "Our accusations," Susan repeated, her voice growing sharper, "are supported by documented evidence of systematic child abuse spanning decades. The inconvenience is not that they became public, but that they were necessary at all." "Alleged evidence," Ginny corrected. "Alleged abuse. You're destroying a good man's reputation based on allegations." Harry felt his temper snap. "Ginny, I lived through the abuse. It's not alleged. It's documented fact. There are medical records, witness statements, photographs of injuries. How much evidence do you need before you'll believe that a child was systematically tortured?" "I need evidence that can't be explained by other means," Ginny shot back. Evidence that doesn't rely on the word of someone who's obviously been traumatized and might not remember things clearly. The implication that his memories of abuse were unreliable hit Harry like a physical blow. You think I imagined being locked in a cupboard for days without food? You think I hallucinated the beatings? I think you might have misunderstood. Stop. The voice came from Hermione Granger, who had just descended from the girls' dormitory, with a stack of books in her arms, and an expression of barely controlled anguish on her face. Just stop, all of you. The common room fell silent again, as Hermione set down her books and looked around the room with the kind of authority that came from being the smartest person present. I've spent the last 3 days researching everything Harry and Susan have claimed, Hermione said, her voice steady despite the tears running down her face. I've verified the authenticity of the documents they've shared. I've cross-referenced their evidence with independent sources. I've examined the magical signatures on correspondence to ensure it wasn't forged. She paused, taking a shaky breath before continuing. Everything they've told us is true. Professor Dumbledore did know about Harry's abuse and chose not to intervene. The Ministry did systematically cover up reports of child welfare violations. There was a coordinated effort to condition magical children for use as weapons in various conflicts. The silence that followed Hermione's announcement was absolute. Harry could hear his own heartbeat, the distant sound of owls outside the windows, the subtle creaking of the castle settling around them. But no one spoke, no one moved, no one seemed to breathe. That's impossible, Ginny said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. It's documented, Hermione replied firmly. It's verifiable, it's true, and our refusal to believe it doesn't make it any less real. But Professor Dumbledore saved Harry's life, Colin protested. He's been protecting him for years. He's been using him for years, Susan corrected. There's a difference between protection and manipulation, between care and control. Before anyone could respond, the portrait hole burst open and Neville Longbottom stumbled in, his round face flushed with exertion and fear. "Harry!" he gasped, struggling to catch his breath. "You need to see this. All of you need to see this." He held up a copy of the Evening Prophet, its headline even more dramatic than the morning edition. Death Eaters Attack Ministry. Bones Girl. Targeted you-know-who claims Dumbledore's weakness proves his superiority. 3 dead, dozens injured in coordinated strike. Harry felt the blood drain from his face as he read the article's opening paragraph, which described a coordinated Death Eater attack on the Ministry that had specifically targeted Department of Magical Law Enforcement personnel involved in investigating the evidence against Dumbledore. The attack had been accompanied by a public statement from Voldemort claiming that Dumbledore's exposure as a child abuser proved his weakness and the inevitability of the Dark Lord's victory. "They're using our evidence," Susan said, her voice hollow with horror. "Voldemort is using our evidence to justify his own violence." "Of course he is," Luna said, matter-of-factly. "Father said this would happen. When you expose corruption at the highest levels of government, it creates chaos that dark forces can exploit." "So what do we do?" Neville asked, his voice cracking with stress. "Do we retract our statements? Claim the evidence was false?" "We can't," Harry said firmly, even as his stomach churned with guilt over the deaths that had resulted from their investigation. "The evidence is true. Dumbledore did commit these crimes. We can't let innocent people continue to suffer just because exposing the truth has political consequences." "But people are dying because of what we revealed," Susan said, her composure finally cracking. 3 Ministry workers are dead because Voldemort used our evidence to justify attacking them. 3 Ministry workers are dead because Voldemort is evil," Hermione said fiercely. "Not because you told the truth about child abuse. Don't let him manipulate you into feeling guilty for exposing crimes that needed to be exposed." "Easy for you to say," Ginny snapped. "You're not the ones who just handed you-know-who the greatest propaganda victory in the history of the wizarding world." "We handed the wizarding world the truth," Harry replied. What they do with that truth is their choice. Their choice? Ginny's voice rose to nearly a shout. Harry, you've just proven to everyone that our greatest leader is no better than a Death Eater. You've destroyed faith in the only institution standing between us and chaos. How is any of that helping anyone? Before Harry could respond, the common room's portrait hole opened again, and Professor McGonagall entered, her face drawn with exhaustion and something that might have been grief. Behind her came several other teachers, including Professor Flitwick and Professor Sprout, all of whom looked like they had aged 10 years overnight. "Mr. Potter, Miss Bones," McGonagall said, her voice carefully controlled. "The headmaster requests your presence in his office immediately." "The headmaster?" Susan asked, confusion clear in her voice. "Professor McGonagall, yesterday we gave Dumbledore an ultimatum to resign or face public exposure. Given that the evidence is now public, I assume he's chosen resignation." McGonagall's expression grew pained. "Professor Dumbledore has not resigned. He has, however, agreed to address the current crisis and the allegations that have been made against him." Harry felt a chill of apprehension. What kind of address? "He intends to hold a public assembly in the Great Hall, where students and faculty can hear his response to the accusations and ask questions about the evidence that has been presented." McGonagall paused, her eyes moving between Harry and Susan. "He has specifically requested that you both be present for this assembly, as the primary accusers, so he can discredit us publicly," Susan said with bitter understanding. "So he can use his reputation and his position to undermine our credibility in front of the entire school." "I don't know his intentions," McGonagall replied, though her voice suggested that she suspected exactly the same thing Susan did. "I can only tell you that he has requested your attendance, and that refusal would be seen as an admission that your accusations cannot withstand public scrutiny." Harry looked around the common room at the faces of his fellow students, some sympathetic, some suspicious, some openly hostile. These were the people he had fought to protect, the community he had risked everything to defend. And now they were looking at him like he was the enemy, like his claims of abuse were more offensive than the abuse itself. "We'll be there," Harry said, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his stomach. "But Professor, I want you to understand something. Whatever Dumbledore says in that assembly, whatever explanations or justifications he offers, the evidence against him is real. The abuse he enabled and orchestrated was real, and our decision to expose it was right, regardless of the political consequences." McGonagall studied his face for a long moment, and Harry thought he saw something like regret in her eyes. "Mr. Potter, I hope you understand that some actions, even when they are morally justified, can have consequences that extend far beyond our intentions." "I understand that, Professor. But I also understand that staying silent about systematic child abuse to protect political stability makes us complicit in that abuse." McGonagall nodded slowly, then gestured toward the portrait hole. "The assembly will begin in 1 hour. I suggest you prepare yourselves for what may be the most important conversation of your lives." As the teachers filed out of the common room, Harry felt the weight of every gaze in the room pressing down on him. Students who had once looked at him with admiration or friendship now watched him with expressions ranging from disappointment to outright anger. The boy who lived, their symbol of hope against the darkness, had become something more complex and uncomfortable, a victim of abuse who refused to stay silent, a truth-teller whose truth was too painful for comfortable consumption. "Harry," Ginny said, as he prepared to leave, her voice softer than before, but still carrying an edge of accusation. "I hope you know what you're doing, because if this destroys our chances of winning the war against you-know-who, if good people die because you couldn't let the past stay buried, that blood will be on your hands." Harry looked at her, this girl he had once thought he loved, this member of the family that had welcomed him as their own, this person who was now asking him to prioritize political convenience over justice for abused children. "Ginny," he said quietly, "if we can only win this war by ignoring the systematic abuse of children, then maybe we don't deserve to win." He left the common room with Susan and Luna flanking him, their presence a reminder that he wasn't entirely alone in this fight. But as they walked through the corridors toward what might be their final confrontation with Dumbledore, Harry couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking toward something that would change the wizarding world forever, and not necessarily for the better. The hallways were filled with students moving toward the Great Hall, their conversations hushed but intense. Harry caught fragments of discussion as they passed, speculation about the evidence, arguments about Dumbledore's character, debates about whether exposing the truth had been worth the chaos it had created. "Harry," Susan said as they approached the entrance to the Great Hall, "whatever happens in there, whatever Dumbledore says or does, I want you to know that I don't regret anything we've done. My aunt died trying to expose these crimes. If her death and our efforts result in protecting even one child from suffering the way you suffered, then it was worth it." "Even if it costs us the war against Voldemort?" Harry asked, genuinely curious about her answer. Susan was quiet for a moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Harry, what's the point of winning a war if the system we're fighting to protect is built on the systematic abuse of children? What's the point of defeating one monster if we leave all the others in positions of power?" Luna nodded in agreement. "Father always says that the real war isn't between good and evil. It's between truth and lies. And the truth is always worth fighting for, even when it's inconvenient or painful or dangerous." Harry felt something settle in his chest, a sense of certainty that had been missing since this journey began. They were right. The truth was worth fighting for, regardless of the consequences. The protection of children was more important than political expediency, and if the wizarding world couldn't handle the truth about their leaders, then perhaps it needed to be forced to confront its own moral failures. As they entered the Great Hall, Harry saw that it had been transformed for the assembly. The house tables had been replaced with rows of chairs facing a raised platform, where Dumbledore stood, flanked by the other teachers and several ministry officials. The hall was packed with students, faculty, and what appeared to be members of the press, all of whom turned to stare as Harry, Susan, and Luna made their way to seats in the front row. Dumbledore looked older than Harry had ever seen him, his blue eyes lacking their usual twinkle, his beard seeming greyer than it had just days before. But there was still something in his posture that spoke of authority and confidence, as if he believed he could still control the narrative of this confrontation. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dumbledore began, his voice carrying clearly throughout the hall, "we are gathered today to address serious allegations that have been made against me and against the institutions I have served. These allegations, while painful and shocking, deserve to be examined openly and honestly." He paused, his eyes finding Harry's across the crowded hall. "I stand before you today, not as an infallible leader, but as a flawed human being who has made difficult decisions in impossible circumstances. Some of those decisions have had consequences that I deeply regret. Some of those decisions have caused pain to people I care about deeply." Another pause, during which Harry could hear the scratching of quills as reporters took notes. "But I also stand before you as someone who has dedicated his life to protecting the innocent and fighting against the forces of darkness that threaten our world. Every choice I have made, every action I have taken, has been in service of that greater purpose." Harry felt his anger building as he listened to Dumbledore's carefully crafted words, the acknowledgement of difficult decisions, and regret without any admission of actual wrongdoing, the positioning of himself as a dedicated servant of the greater good rather than a systematic abuser of children. Dumbledore was going to try to spin this. He was going to use his reputation and his rhetorical skills to convince the wizarding world that his crimes were really noble sacrifices, that his victims were really willing participants in a greater cause. and Harry realized, with a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying, that he was not going to let that happen. The battle for truth was just beginning, and Harry Potter was done being anyone's victim, even his own community's need for comfortable lies. When Dumbledore finished his opening statement and opened the floor for questions, Harry was going to stand up and tell the real truth, in his own words, regardless of the consequences. The time for protecting other people's feelings was over. The time for choosing political convenience over justice was over. The time for the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth had finally arrived. And this time, Harry was not going to be silenced. Chapter 9. The Price of Justice. The Great Hall had never felt more like a courtroom than it did in the moments before Dumbledore opened the floor for questions. Harry sat in the front row, feeling the weight of hundreds of eyes pressing down on him like a physical burden. The assembled crowd, students, teachers, ministry officials, and members of the press, waited in tense silence for the confrontation they all knew was coming. Dumbledore stood at the podium with the bearing of someone who had spent decades commanding respect through sheer presence. Even now, even with documented evidence of his crimes spread across the front pages of every major publication in the wizarding world, he projected an aura of moral authority that made many in the audience seem to question their own doubts about him. "I will now take questions," Dumbledore announced, his blue eyes sweeping across the assembled crowd. "I ask only that we conduct ourselves with the dignity and respect that such serious matters deserve." For a moment, no one moved. The silence stretched until Harry began to wonder if anyone would have the courage to challenge the man who had shaped the wizarding world for the better part of a century. Then Susan Bones stood up. "Professor Dumbledore," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall despite its slight tremor. "In your correspondence with ministry officials regarding Harry Potter's placement with his relatives, you wrote that his suffering was necessary to ensure his compliance with your future plans. How do you reconcile that statement with your claim to be protecting his welfare?" The question hit like a physical blow. Harry could hear the sharp intake of breath from the audience, see the way reporters leaned forward with their quills poised. But Dumbledore's expression remained serene, almost grandfatherly. "Miss Bones," he said gently, "I understand that grief over your aunt's tragic death has led you to seek someone to blame for that loss. But I fear you have misinterpreted correspondence that was taken out of context and possibly altered by those who wish to undermine our cause." "The correspondence has been verified by multiple independent magical analysts," Susan replied firmly. "The magical signatures are authentic, the parchment dating is accurate, and the ink composition matches known samples from your private study. Are you claiming that this verification is also fabricated?" "I am suggesting that even authentic documents can be edited or presented in ways that distort their original meaning." Dumbledore's voice carried the patience of someone explaining a complex concept to a child. Magic can preserve altered documents as easily as original ones. Harry felt his anger building at Dumbledore's casual dismissal of evidence that had cost so much to gather. But before he could stand to respond, another voice cut through the hall. "What about the medical records?" Everyone turned to see Hermione Granger, standing in the middle section of seats, her usually neat hair disheveled and her face pale with emotional strain. "The medical records documenting Harry's injuries," Hermione continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "The photographs taken during his first examination at Hogwarts, the reports from Muggle doctors who treated him for broken bones and malnutrition. Are you claiming those were also fabricated?" Dumbledore's expression grew pained, and for the first time since the assembly began, Harry saw a crack in his composure.